Chapter 42. My name is Scott. This is my partner, Mia. After Peter left, the youth pointed to a tall and slender woman next to him. He said to Dean and others, "We will be the captains of this operation for the next 10 days. It's best for everyone to listen to my commands. If there's a mess, then it's not good for everyone. Moreover, there will be no small punishment when we return to the consortium." Hearing the punishment, Macon, Zack, and several other surly children immediately became obedient and obediently promised. Scott looked at Dudian. "Little guy, what's your name?" Dudian. "Good potential." Scott nodded slightly. "But don't be arrogant. In front of death, potential is meaningless. You will follow behind me. I will tell you some things that you need to pay attention to." Is he going to teach me step by step? Dudian could not help but have a good impression of this person. He nodded slightly to show that he understood. The people behind them heard this. They knew that Scott was going to focus on training Dudian. For a time, many of them were secretly jealous, but they didn't say anything. After all, Dudian's identity as a seed was there. Moreover, he had obtained 2 blessings. Whether it was force or identity, they couldn't shake him. Moreover, there were 3 dormitory brothers behind Dudian. They were the strongest and most united group in their group. Even the grumpy children who didn't care about the consequences didn't dare to provoke Dudian, Mason, Zack, and Shay. "Well, this is your food and water for the next 10 days. This time I have brought it for you. Next time you go to the headquarters to get it." Scott pointed to more than a dozen black backpacks on the ground. Dudian looked at the black traveler's backpack. He picked one up and untied the rope. He saw that the backpack was filled with mud balls. He had seen them in Jura's house. They were mashed potato balls. The taste was very bad, but it was easy to fill. In other words, after eating one, he wouldn't have the appetite to eat the second one. Mason, Zack, and Shay followed behind Dudian. They quickly picked up 3 backpacks that looked a little bigger. Scott laughed as he saw that the people behind him also wanted to learn from the 3 of them. "Don't choose. It's the same weight. It's given by the headquarters. There's never a mistake. Use your little cleverness later." Mason, Zack, and Sham smiled in embarrassment. "What is this?" At this time, Scott noticed the black powder tube on Dudian's waist. "It's not worth mentioning," Dean said. "It won't hinder me." Scott nodded and didn't say anything else. He turned to the 20 consortium scavengers in the distance and said, "Gather here and prepare to depart." The 20 consortium scavengers were adults with dark skin. Some of them were older than Scott. Scott had summoned all of them. Their standard soft armor was the same as Dudian's. Obviously, the consortium's powerful financial resources were able to guarantee the supply of these hardware equipment. "Bosku, which district are we going to today?" a skinny youth asked. "Zone 8. Scott turned to the silent black-armored woman, Mia, and said, "It's getting late. Shall we go?" Mia nodded slightly. Scott waved his hand and took the lead in the front. He said to Dudian and other newcomers, "The outer edge has been completely cleared. You don't have to worry about anything. Save your strength." Dudian and others thought that Scott was right. Their tight muscles gradually relaxed as they looked around the surrounding environment. There was a wasteland nearby. The ground was quite humid. Dudian had previously noticed that there were a lot of moss on the giant wall. It was completely different from the sandy terrain behind the giant wall. "Is this the outside of the giant wall? It's completely different from what I imagined. I thought that everywhere was a desert." Mason, who was behind Dudian, looked around in surprise. Zack laughed. "We don't have to worry about the water problem. We can find a place to dig a hole and squeeze out water." Scott heard his words and glanced back at him. "There are puddles everywhere on the ground. You don't need to dig a hole to find water. I'm afraid you won't dare to drink." Zack was stunned. Dudian saw that Scott didn't explain, so he said to him, "The radiation outside the giant wall is too high. Even if the water is filtered by the soil, it is not drinkable. If you want to drink water, you have to dig at least tens of meters deep. The difficulty of digging a few meters in the desert is the same as digging a few meters in the desert. It is a waste of physical strength. So we have to save a lot of water. Hearing Dudien's words, Zach and several other children had a puzzled expression on their faces. Scott looked back at Dudien but didn't say anything. He continued to lead the way in front. After walking for more than 10 miles, they suddenly came to a place with less vegetation on the ground. To be precise, they came to a ruin. Dudien was stunned as he saw the ruins. This was a broken city? In front of him was an asphalt street, but the street was covered with moss and lush vegetation. There were concrete high-rise buildings on both sides of the street. There were 2 or 3-story shops, but at the moment all of them had collapsed and broken. There was only a crumbling wall that was isolated. It was covered with vines and moss. It seemed that after a few years, it would be completely buried by these dense growth of plants. There were some broken clothes scattered on the desolate street. These messy clothes were obviously very old. They were soaked by the rain and covered with dust. They had long turned into hard and black stone-like objects. Only a rough shape and outline could be seen. Dudien was completely stunned. This was the appearance of a ruined city. Could it be that this was what Earth would look like 300 years after the catastrophe? Once the prosperity, the lights of civilization, the footprints of human beings all over the earth. Was it like the ruins in front of him, leaving only empty shells after the disaster? He suddenly felt that his chest was blocked by something. He couldn't breathe. His eyes were moist. Dean. Mason saw Dudien suddenly stop and could not help but pat his shoulder. Dudien recovered and saw that Scott and Mia had walked into the street in front of him. He quickly followed them. However, when his feet stepped onto the asphalt street that was covered by vegetation, his heart was filled with all sorts of feelings. The longing for his parents and sister was like a flame that crawled into his mind. However, he was very sorrowfully aware that those who had passed could never come back. This was the reality, just like the reality of the ruins in front of him. This is area number 9. It has been scavenged. Scott saw that the people behind didn't keep up in time. He turned back and waved, "Hurry up, don't waste your life." Dudien slightly pursed his lips and bowed his head to keep up with him. Along the way, Dudien saw that the street had been scavenged very clean. Basically, in addition to the collapsed houses, there was nothing left. In such a spacious street, there should be many scrapped cars. But he didn't see a single one. Obviously, as Scott said, they had been scavenged. But why the technology inside the giant wall was so backward even after the old era's technology had been picked up? Was it because of the serious nuclear radiation corrosion for 300 years that there was no research value? Chapter 43. Were there people living here before? Mason, Zach, Sand and others looked at the ruined walls on both sides of the street covered with vegetation. They were surprised. From the traces of the broken walls they could see that there were residential buildings, but the architectural style was very different. Of course. Scott looked up at the surrounding ruins. This is the place where our ancestors used to live. But the disaster has invaded and now it is desolate. However, there are still things left behind by our ancestors here. Our role is to bring these things back and hand them over to the consortium. The place where our ancestors lived. Mason and others were excited as they heard Scott's words. They curiously looked at everything around them. Dean saw a sheepskin map in Scott's hand. He looked around the gap between Scott's arms and saw a crooked route on the map. In the center, there was a huge square pattern with the words, "Sylvia's Giant Wall" written on it. Outside the giant wall, there were irregular circles outlined by curved lines. There were numbers marked on the top of the circle. 0, number 1. Dean glanced at the map and found that the numbers were repeated. There were 6 or 7 symbols in the 0 area. However, these symbols and circles were outlined in different colors. It was as gorgeous as a rainbow. Scott saw that Dean was looking at the map, so he smiled. This is the scavenging map outside the giant wall. Each consortium's hunters will mark the area after they have swept it. Our Melon Consortium's area is marked with red lines and handwriting. Other green and yellow areas belong to other consortiums. There are records on the back of the map. Green represents the military and yellow represents the Huasheng Consortium. Dean nodded slightly. He had already guessed it when he saw these circles with different colors. He asked, "What is the gray area outside?" "This is the place that the hunters haven't swept yet." Scott smiled and said in a serious tone, "You must not step into these gray areas. It is extremely dangerous. Even the hunters may die." "Dangerous?" Dean was curious. "What kind of danger?" "Monsters," Scott whispered. Dean's heart jumped. "Monsters?" At this time, Scott passed a corner. There was a collapsed traffic light on the street, but it was covered with vegetation and entangled with many vines. So it wasn't collected by the scavengers. Zone 8 is just ahead. Scott looked at the street in front of the corner. It was still in ruins, but because it was close to the center of the city, there was less vegetation. A large number of broken walls and collapsed houses were all exposed. The desolate street was damaged by the aftermath of the earthquake. The street was cracked, and there were many deep craters on the ground that looked like small meteorites. "Everyone, be careful." Scott looked dignified as he pulled out the dagger from his waist and said, "The 8th area is the area that the hunter just cleared. We are the second team to enter this area. Although the harvest will be very rich, but it is very likely that we will encounter some small monsters. Don't let them attack you or you will be infected." Dean, Macon and other newcomers couldn't help but feel nervous. They learned from Scott and pulled out their weapons. They vigilantly scanned the surrounding environment and the fluffy vegetation near the street. Dean followed Scott into the middle of the street. He saw a new wooden road sign on the side of the road. There was a blood-red word, number 8, written on it. It meant that the area in front of them was under the control of the Melon Consortium. Dean looked at the street in front of him. It was obvious that the street hadn't been cleaned. He could vaguely see lumps of green vegetation. From the outline, it seemed that there were scrapped cars under the vegetation. His heart jumped. If there were cars, then naturally there would be generators. Although after more than 300 years, these things had long been reduced to scrap iron under the rain and ultraviolet rays. But maybe he could find some well-preserved parts. Scott said in a low voice, "There are some large resources hidden under these green plants. We'll think of a way to bring them back when we return. First, we'll find a place to stay and use it as our base camp for the next 10 days. After that, we'll split up and search for resources." Saying that, he walked past the abandoned cars covered in green plant. Dean and the 20 consortium scavengers followed them. No one noticed that one of the cars was covered with thick plant. A pale and withered hand was struggling to grab the people who had gone far away. At the end of the street there was a crossroads. There were collapsed street lamps and huge billboards on the ground. But they had long been covered with vegetation. Scott looked up and chose a 3-story building that was relatively intact. He said, "This is it. First, clean up the materials inside and gather them." After saying that, he led the team to the 3-story building. "Ah!" a girl behind Dean's team exclaimed. She pointed to the ground in front of the building and trembled. "Blood, blood!" Everyone looked at the ground. There was a pool of blood. Although it had dried up, but from the color it was obvious that it was left recently. After all, the blood on the ground couldn't stay for long under the washing of the rain. Dean's face slightly changed. He thought of the monster that Scott had mentioned. He subconsciously grasped the gunpowder at his waist. The other children were nervous as they saw the blood on the ground. Scott frowned. "What's the fuss about? I told you that there are monsters in these places. This is obviously the blood of the hunter who killed the monster. Don't be surprised again, rookie." His patience towards the other new scavengers was obviously not as high as his patience towards Dean. Mia, who was next to him, came forward and pushed the door of the building. The door was made of glass, but the glass had long been broken. It seemed to be a shop. Although the vegetation had spread all over the walls, there was still a simple layout and a few counters. Dean followed Scott into the shop. He saw that the ground and walls of the broken shop were covered with thick dust. The dust had accumulated over a long period of time. Scott used the hilt of his dagger to push away the vegetation on the counter. He saw some dusty gold jewelry in the glass cabinet. Scott's eyes lit up. He immediately used the hilt of his dagger to break the glass and grabbed the jewelry inside. He used his clothes to wipe off the dust, revealing the golden luster. He bit his teeth. His face was full of surprise again. Chapter 44. It's gold. Mason, Zack and others also noticed the jewelry on the counter. Their faces showed a bit of excitement. The smile on Scott's face disappeared when he heard their words. He faintly turned his head and said, "Let me make it clear first. Although we are a team, the materials we pick up are counted separately. This has always been the rule. I'm not deliberately bullying you." He pointed at the 20 consortium scavengers. Mason and others' faces changed as they turned to look at him. They saw the consortium scavengers were led by a skinny youth. He nodded and said, "Yes, the materials we pick up are all based on our ability. So don't think about being lazy. Whoever is lucky enough to pick up the most is the one who has the ability." Mason and others were frustrated. There was no doubt that Scott was the first to find the gold jewelry. Naturally, it was his materials. They couldn't get any commission. Dudian was disappointed as he heard the rules. But he soon cheered up. The rules were actually fair for the newcomers. At least the materials they picked up wouldn't be shared with others. Scott was lucky enough to randomly pick a place to stay. It happened to be a gold shop, so he made a lot of money. At this time, Scott smashed all the glass on the cabinet. He pulled out all the jewelry and piled them up in one of the cabinet. Then he clenched his dagger and said, "Let's go upstairs and clean up." He thought of something and turned to Dudian and others. "Everyone has picked up the materials. It's best not to try to steal or use other dirty methods to seize them. If the owner of the materials dies in the process of scavenging, then the materials he picked up will belong to the consortium and won't be shared." Dudian knew that he was warning the newcomers not to be blinded by greed. At the same time, he secretly appreciated that the consortium had set up such rules to a large extent to prevent the scavengers from killing each other in the wilderness. After hearing Scott's words, the children standing at the end of the line clenched their weapons and followed the team. Scott and Mia took the lead as they walked along the stairs. The corridor was covered with vegetation. There were cracks as thick as a finger. There were some things scattered on the ground. Although covered with thick dust and vegetation, Dudian recognized them at a glance. They were women's shoes and wallets. It seemed that they were silently telling of the riots that had taken place here. Bang! Suddenly, a middle-aged consortium scavenger stepped on the stairs and collapsed. His whole body also fell down and hit the ground. Fortunately, this was only the first floor, and he had a blessed physique, so he did not suffer any injuries. But this sudden movement scared the others. Scott looked back and frowned. "Be careful." He took the lead and went to the second floor. The corridor was dark. The ventilation windows had long been covered with vegetation. The sunlight couldn't penetrate. It was damp and dark inside. Scott took out a fire sickle and lit a torch. The dim yellow light illuminated the surroundings. He held the torch and walked in front. When he reached the first room in the corridor, he saw that the door of the room was half closed. Scott gently pushed the door open. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind blew out of the room, almost extinguishing the torch. Scott slightly lowered the torch. His other hand was holding a sword. He slowly entered the room. He saw that the floor was in a mess. The chairs were overturned, the curtains were torn in half, the windows were broken, and the vegetation was dense outside. Gotcha! Suddenly, a slight sound came from the depths of the room. Scott's face changed. He immediately raised the torch to illuminate the room. He saw that there was a bathroom in the room. The bathroom curtain had collapsed on the ground. Two pale and dry thighs were sticking out of the bathroom. As his torch shone, he immediately saw that the owner of the thighs was a woman whose face was completely rotten. The slight sound came from her chest. There was actually a huge black mouse lying on the ground, constantly gnawing on the woman's chest. Dean's pupils shrank as he saw the scene from the gap between Scott's arms. The size of the mouse was as big as a hound. Its body was covered with thick dark hair and exuded a strong rancid smell. Its tail was as thick as an adult's finger. It was gnawing the corpse with relish. "It's a monster!" Scott was the first to react. He roared and slashed with his sword. The huge rat that was eating the woman sensed the fire behind it. It turned its head and looked over. Its eyes were bloodshot and filled with violence. Its sharp mouth was stained with sticky blood, and a few extremely long whiskers were fluttering slightly. It seemed to notice that Scott had more people on his side. It paused for a moment, then suddenly turned around and ran into the bathroom. It stepped on the bathtub and jumped out of the window. At this time, Scott and Mia's attacks all failed. They looked at each other with lingering fear. At this time, Macon and others also noticed the movement. They heard Scott's words and gathered around. Scott whispered, "It escaped." Then he put down the torch and shined it on the dead woman. The woman seemed to have died with her eyes wide open. Her pupils were light green as she stared at him. "It stinks," Macon said while covering his nose. Dean forgot to breathe. His heart was full of shock. Could it be that after 300 years of nuclear radiation, the genes of the mice that lived here had mutated to such a terrible degree? His gaze landed on the woman. She was completely naked, and her body was covered by the bathroom curtain. The stiff flesh around her chest had been gnawed deeply by the rat, and even half of her heart had been bitten off. Her ribs could be seen mixed in with the dry, hard flesh. However, his gaze landed on the woman's glabella, where there was a bloody hole the size of a finger. It was as though she had been shot by a bullet? Dean was startled for a moment. He rejected the possibility of a bullet. Instead, it was more likely that it was caused by a bow and arrow. After all, the power of a bullet could cause obvious tear and damage to the flesh around the bullet hole. However, what made him unable to understand was that if this woman had died from a bow and arrow, then she had died in the hands of a human. Who would use a bow and arrow to kill her? Suddenly, he thought of a point that he had overlooked. Suddenly, his whole body's hair stood up. This woman was obviously taking a bath. But the water system in this house should have been broken long ago. Whether the other side was a scavenger or a hunter, they would never be able to endure not taking a bath for 10 days. Most importantly, people in this world would rarely take a bath like this. Is she a human from 300 years ago? Did she die in the bath? But if so, her body should have rotted long ago. Dean was startled. At this time, Mia suddenly squatted down. It seemed that she didn't want the woman to die in the wilderness. She slightly lifted the curtain to cover her body. However, when she lifted the curtain, Dean inadvertently saw that the woman's arm was actually a sharp claw. The nails turned into sharp and long thorns. 5 sharp thorns were slightly curved. It was hard to imagine how much damage would be caused by such a hand. Chapter 45. Undead, undead, Scott murmured. There was a trace of disappointment on his face as he saw Mia carefully cover her body. He sighed. "Clean up the room. This thing must be burned, otherwise it will breed other monsters." Mia's mouth slightly moved. She silently got up and looked at the woman's rotten face. Eventually, she turned her head and started to clean up other usable materials in the room. Dean was shocked as he heard Scott's words. He could not help but ask, "What is an undead undead?" Scott looked back at Mia's back. He saw her silently picking up the materials on the ground and the table. He sighed and said to Dean, Undead is one of the monsters of the undead family. Their power is extremely terrible. They have night vision ability. Even if they don't eat or drink, they won't die. They like the taste of blood. So any creature that gets close to them will be eaten by them. Moreover, they will absorb the life force from the flesh and blood they eat to enhance their strength. In short, the more people or animals they eat, the more terrible they will be. Dean could not help but ask, How did they come here? Scott sighed. They are infected by the devil's power. These undead were human beings before their death. But they couldn't withstand the temptation of the devil's power. Eventually they abandoned their souls. Although they got eternal life, they lost their personality and all the memories of their life. They became the devil's minions. Infected? Dean naturally did not believe in the devil's words. He asked, Is it because of the radiation? Scott did not expect him to get to the bottom of the matter. He looked at him and shook his head. Of course not. Radiation will only damage the body and cause some distorted changes. But it will never turn people into such monsters. They were infected by the devil's power. This power is like a plague and can spread to each other. For example, the bone-biter rat that escaped earlier is a low-level monster. Once it bites you, you will also be infected. Dean could not help but be stunned. Infect each other? Isn't this a virus? But where did this virus come from? Could it be that 300 years ago, when he was asleep, other things happened in the world? Scott sighed and said, These rats like to hide in dark corners and are often ignored by hunters. Although we can kill them with our strength, but if we are not careful and get scratched by them, we will be infected and turn into an undead. Scott sighed and said, These rats like to hide in dark corners and are often ignored by hunters. At this point, he glanced at Mia, who was picking up the resources, and sighed. Mia's ex-husband had his arm bitten by a steel fur rat. Clang! A metal object in Mia's hand suddenly fell to the ground. Scott sighed but didn't say anything more. He looked at Dean and others. Everyone split up and cleaned the rooms. Remember to be careful, as these monsters can smell the blood in our bodies. Although this one ran away, but it must be lingering nearby. Be careful of them hiding in the dark to attack you. It's best for the rookies to form a team of 4 and look out for each other. If anything happens, just call for help. His instructions were mainly for Dean and the other newcomers. Although the consortium scavengers were not as good as the regular scavengers, but they had come to scavenge more often. They already knew what they needed to know, so there was no need for him to explain more. Hearing Scott's order, the people at the back scattered. However, Mason, Zach, Sham, and several other children were standing in front of them. They saw the terrible appearance of the undead on the ground, as well as the huge size of the rat. Their hearts were filled with anxiety. They had never seen such a bloody scene before. For a time, the knowledge they learned in the usual training suddenly disappeared. At the moment, they just wanted to hug Scott and stick close to him. Scott looked at the pale faces of the children and slightly frowned. Scavenging is not such a simple job. Didn't your instructor tell you? If you continue to follow me, then you won't be able to pick up anything. It's equivalent to a wasted trip. You probably don't know, but if your scavenging results are ranked at the bottom several times, then you will be expelled by the consortium. Expelled? Mason, Zach, Sham, and others turned pale. They clenched their teeth and resisted the fear in their hearts. They clenched their weapons and turned to leave. Dean was about to turn to leave, but Scott shouted, "You don't have to follow them. Just follow behind me. I'll give you 1/3 of the things I've picked up. You just have to learn how to scavenge. Next time no one will take you." Dean frowned. "I want to see alone. If something happens, I will call for help." Scott was taken aback. He looked at him and said, "All right, be careful." Dean nodded slightly and said to Mason and the other two, "Let's go." Mason secretly gave him a thumbs up. After they left the room, Dean saw that the other rooms on the second floor had been searched. He immediately said, let's go to the third floor. Mason, Zack and Sham didn't have any objection. In the course of 3 years of training, they had almost formed the habit of letting Dean have the final say. The third floor was also the top floor. The vegetation was sparse. Gray and turbid sunlight shone through the gaps of the broken windows and sprinkled on the ground. There was a thick layer of dust on the floor. There were dried bloodstains on the walls. There were messy things scattered in the corridor. There were several corpses lying on the ground. Some bodies were cut at the waist, and some heads were smashed by some heavy object. There were traces of blades on the walls. Obviously, there had been hunters here and there had been a battle. Dean noticed that the fingers of these corpses were sharp claws. It seemed that they were infected by the virus. Although he didn't know where the virus came from, but there was no doubt that the virus had such an amazing effect. It was absolutely something that could be produced by the world's top biological research institute. It was even possible that it was created by those guys. Mason, Zack and Sham saw the corpses on the ground. They swallowed their saliva and trembled. Although they had killed poisonous snakes, lizards and other animals in the training, they had seen blood, but they were numb to it. But the corpses lying in front of them were human beings. They had the same life as them. This kind of fear made the 3 of them feel nauseous. They felt their limbs were cold. It seemed that the corpses would suddenly climb up and rush towards them to take their lives. Dean was also afraid, but he tried to keep calm. With the help of the sunlight, he came to the front of the first room. The door of the room was open. The anti-theft chain was broken. It was obvious that it had been broken by violence. There were traces of fighting in the room. There was a pool of blood on the ground. There were 2 corpses. It was a young man and a woman. Their skin was abnormally pale. To be precise, it was gray without blood. Faint blue veins appeared on their bodies. Their fingers were sharp. Their hands and feet were thin. It seemed that all the fat in their body had been sucked out, leaving only muscle tissue. Dean put on a scavenger's mask, and immediately felt the stench was a lot lighter. His voice was a bit low through the mask. Don't touch the body, look for other things around first. His eyes swept through the room. At a glance, he saw a laptop covered with a thick layer of dust. Chapter 46. At this time, Mason, Zack and Sham were also searching for materials in their respective rooms. They deliberately avoided the 2 corpses on the ground. Although they knew that the 2 corpses were dead, but because of this they were afraid. After searching around, Mason and the other 2 found some metal objects. Although they did not know the role of these objects, but in their values, as long as it was a metal object, it must be valuable. Dean saw them pick up mobile phones, TV remote controls, electric lights and so on. His heart could not help but be curious. Scavengers should have found a lot of these things. How come the consortiums didn't study anything from them? However, when he saw the twisted metal behind the mobile phone, he suddenly understood that the 300 years in the radiation zone and the 300 years in a normal ecological environment were very different. Although these items were still there, but they have long been distorted under the accumulation of nuclear radiation. The parts were completely deformed. If one did not know the original use of these distorted parts, it was impossible to speculate useful things. The only thing that could resist the nuclear radiation was lead and gold and other high-density metals. This was why the gold jewelry on the counter had not changed much. Go to the next room. Dean swept around and did not see anything valuable. He turned and left the room. This was the advantage of going to the newly swept area to scavenge. Not only the value of the things picked up was high, but also there was room to choose. Like the rooms they had seen today, in the future there will be other scavengers who will come to sweep, but they can only pick some cloth clothes, or remove the metal from the beds, refrigerators and other large objects. Mason and the other 2 did not want to stay in the room with the corpses, so they immediately retreated. In the corridor, several corpses were lying quietly. It was exceptionally quiet. Dean looked at these corpses. He always felt that they would suddenly wake up. His heart was pounding. He suppressed his thoughts and opened the door of the second room. Not surprisingly, there were several corpses lying in this room. Looking at their short-sleeved clothes, it was obvious that they were people from 300 years ago. Dean had to be sure of one thing. 300 years ago, when the global nuclear bomb broke out, there was also a terrible virus disaster. This unknown virus turned all the infected people into terrible undead. Even if they stayed in the nuclear radiation zone for 300 years, they still didn't die. It could be seen how terrible and tenacious the virus in their bodies was. Dean bypassed the 3 corpses on the ground and searched the room for things. He was mainly looking for computers, mobile phones, and other electrical appliances. After all, in a residential house like this, the only valuable things were these things. There was a desktop computer in the room. Dean naturally would not carry the whole computer back. He disassembled the computer. The electrical box and some wires inside were full of dust. When he saw the electrical box, his heart moved. He was just about to disassemble it. Who would have thought that when his palm touched the electrical box, it was like touching a thin layer of paper, easily poking into the electrical box. The electrical box had completely deteriorated after being exposed to nuclear radiation for so long. Dean sighed and looked at the other wires. The plastic outside these wires was distorted and bloated. Some of the small resistors on the motherboard were shriveled and swollen. Some of them were swollen into a strange shape. They had lost their original appearance under the nuclear radiation. Dean shook his head slightly and gave up the machine. After all, today was only the first day of scavenging. There were still 9 days left. There were many things that could be picked up, but the things he could carry were very limited. If there is a truck, I can carry as much as I want. Such an idea suddenly emerged in Dean's mind. His heart was suddenly smart, but soon he was discouraged. The scrapped cars outside were obviously similar to this computer. Many parts had deteriorated or deformed and could not be repaired. If he wanted to make a mechanical transportation tool, he had to rely on the superchip. And the premise of all this was, there must be electricity. Dean turned and continued to search for other things. He only saw one way to make a generator, which was a wind generator. To make a wind generator, first of all, he needed an open field. Even if he went to the slums to buy such a field, it would cost a lot of money, so he still had to have money first. When Dean and others were searching the third room, the others also went up to the third floor and searched around. After half an hour, the building was completely searched. The goods that each person had plundered were piled up in the hall on the first floor. Everyone registered with Scott to prevent confusion and to prevent others from stealing. Obviously, in the long history of scavenging, scavengers have long understood that eliminating civil strife was the best way to get the greatest benefits. Now, everyone, go and search around the area, Scott said to everyone after he finished registering. The 20 consortium scavengers were already impatient. They immediately formed groups of 4 or 5 and left the shop to search for materials in the nearby ruins. Scott looked at Dean and said, "Mia and I are also going to search for materials. Do you want to go with us?" Dean shook his head. "No, I'll go with my friend." "All right, call for help if there is any danger. It is very quiet here, so you can basically hear everything. Just don't go too far." Scott didn't insist. Dean nodded and turned around to call Mason, Zach, and Sham. They went along the street and searched the nearby buildings. Because he knew these shops, Dean basically didn't need to go inside to know what kind of things he could find in the ruins. He didn't search every building one by one like the others, but moved along the street and soon found a small and medium-sized supermarket. The supermarket was covered with vegetation, but it was still recognizable as a supermarket from the style. But he didn't know what kind of disaster it had suffered. The supermarket had collapsed from the middle. There were a few corpses lying on the ground in front of the door. So many undeads. Mason and the other 2 saw the corpses on the ground and their faces turned ugly. They came to the 8th area and they could see corpses everywhere. They couldn't imagine what kind of scene the hunters faced when they came here for the first time. Dean was also a little scared, but he still kept his calm. It seemed that the hunters had kicked open the door of the supermarket. Suddenly he saw the ground was covered with corpses of the undeads. At the same time, there was a low gnawing sound. There seemed to be 7 or 8 red spots in the darkness. Mutant monsters. Dean's pupil shrank as he quickly retreated. Chapter 47. Dean hurriedly rolled sideways to avoid the attack of the gray shadow. At the same time, he looked up. It was a giant rat with pitch-black hair. It looked the same as the bone-biter rat that had escaped before, but its body was a bit thinner. At this moment, it was like a hound, baring its sharp teeth and staring at him with blood-red eyes. Monster! Mason, Zack, and Sand screamed. Their faces were a little pale and their legs were a little soft. Whoosh! The bone-biter rat missed its attack. After landing, it jumped up again and pounced on Dean, who was the closest to it. Dean's hair stood up. The speed of the bone-biter rat was too fast. He had no time to dodge again. Moreover, it was the first time he faced such a battle. His brain reaction was a little slow, and he instinctively raised his arm to resist. With a bang, he felt that his upper body was hit by a heavy object. He lost his balance and fell backward, sitting on the ground. He was so scared that he instinctively wanted to close his eyes, but the last bit of reason in his heart reminded him that he would only be waiting for death if he did so. He struggled to open his eyes, only to see the bone-biter rat pouncing on him. The rat's sharp mouth was extremely long, and its tiny teeth were tightly biting his arm. Panic, fear, and longing for time to stop. Save me! Save me! A lot of chaotic thoughts suddenly poured into his mind. When life encountered a desperate situation, instinct immediately completely swallowed up reason. However, this was only a momentary thought. Dean had a calm mind for a long time, so he quickly recovered his reason in panic. When he saw the bone-biter rat's upper and lower jaws were constantly wriggling and chewing his arm, a sharp pain came from his arm. His heart was filled with a huge anger. Ah! Dean roared and swung his arm, smashing it on the street. At the same time, he turned over and climbed up. His other hand released the dagger and grabbed the hind leg of the bone-biter rat that was biting his right arm. He pulled hard, and at the same time, his right arm kept hitting the ground, making its head violently hit the ground. Bang! 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 After continuous violent smashing and pulling, the bone-biter rat did not persist and quickly loosened its mouth. Dean roared and shook its body, smashing it on the ground. Bang! The bone-biter rat hit the hard ground, and its hair and flesh offset a lot of the impact. Die for me! Die! Die! Dean roared and smashed the bone-biter rat on the ground again and again. The bone-biter rat's hard head collided with the ground, and its bones immediately cracked. Soon, blood spilled from the corner of the bone-biter rat's mouth. As Dean swung it high, the blood spilled along the corner of its mouth like a parabola. With a bang, Dean didn't know how many times he had swung the mouse, but the anger in his heart gradually subsided. A sense of exhaustion spread through his arms. He looked at the bone-biter rat that had lost its struggle, gritted his teeth, picked up the dagger on the ground, and fiercely stabbed it in the stomach. The dagger was extremely sharp. After 7 or 8 consecutive stabs, blood stained the dagger. Dean saw that the bone-biter rat had completely lost its movement, so he stopped attacking. He only felt that his heart was still beating wildly. Recalling the previous frightening scene, he still had a lingering fear. This was the first time he faced fear and death. Although he had seen the most terrible doomsday, it was just the tip of the iceberg that he had seen on TV. It was like watching a disaster movie, and it was completely different from his own experience. Without looking in the mirror, Dean could feel that his face was extremely ugly at the moment, and his appearance was also extremely embarrassing. He slightly gasped and looked at his right arm. There were several deep teeth marks on it. Fortunately, the material of the black soft armor was extremely hard, and there was a layer of lead metal inside, so it was not bitten by the bonebiter rat. Otherwise, the speed of infection through saliva would be much faster than other ways. He would probably become an undead like Mia's husband, that Scott said. Dean! Macon shouted in vain. Dean was startled and looked up at him, but he saw Macon suddenly rushed over, raising his dagger and chopping head-on. Dean suddenly woke up, thinking of the 7 or 8 red spots he had seen in the supermarket, and hurriedly rolled on the ground. Puff! Macon's dagger fiercely stabbed the back of Dean at the moment when he dodged. Blood sputtered out. The dagger stabbed the chest of a bonebiter rat that jumped over. It was the softest part of the bonebiter rat, and the dagger directly stabbed into it. Dean hurriedly looked back, and suddenly saw that in addition to the bonebiter rat that was stabbed to death by Macon, 3 bonebiter rats rushed out from the broken glass door of the supermarket. Their blood-red eyes stared at them. Like agile cheetahs, they quickly jumped from left to right and rushed toward Macon and Dean. Dean's face was ugly. He grabbed the dagger and retreated again and again. The dagger in his hand kept gently waving to intimidate these things. However, the simple intimidation did not scare these bonebiter rat. One of them jumped in front of Dean and jumped over. Dean hurriedly slashed the dagger. The blade cut the bonebiter rat's hair, but it was removed by the greasy and tough hair. The blade slipped and stuck to the bonebiter rat's body. It was like using a sword to slap it, and it did not cause any damage at all. The next moment, the bonebiter rat fell on Dean's chest. The 2 sharp claws in front of it waved and scratched Dean's face. It was like the hunting instinct of a beast, knowing to attack the opponent's vital parts. Dean hurriedly grabbed its hair. Once the skin was scratched by it, the germs accumulated in the claws would immediately infect him. However, the friction of the black soft armor gloves was not big, and the bonebiter rat's hair was extremely slippery. Dean tried his best, but he still felt the hair slipping in his hands. Once again, his life was facing a desperate situation. Dean roared and suddenly turned over with his feet on the ground. His body twisted in a very soft posture, and he stood up without using his hands. At the same time, his arm grabbed the last trace of hair and pushed the bonebiter mouse to the side, sending it flying. The bonebiter rat fell to the ground, rolled around, and climbed up again. It bared its teeth and rushed toward Dean again. Dean's heart tightened, his whole body muscles tightened, and his spirit was highly concentrated at this moment. At the moment when the bonebiter rat rushed over, he kicked out. With a bang, the bonebiter rat jumped up. Just at this moment, Dean's foot seemed to have expected its attack and accurately kicked the position of the bonebiter rat. The kick was extremely heavy. The bonebiter rat let out a sharp scream and flew upside down. Dean did not stop but took the initiative to rush out. When the bonebiter rat fell, Dean had already caught up. Taking advantage of the fact that it had not climbed up, he clenched the dagger with both hands and stabbed it down. With a bang, the dagger stabbed into its abdomen and penetrated into its abdomen. The bonebiter rat suddenly suffered great pain and struggled violently. At the same time, it let out a harsh scream. Dean gritted his teeth and used all his strength to hold the dagger, firmly nailing it to the ground. No matter how it struggled and screamed, he did not let go. Chapter 48. Ah! A panicked scream came. Dean was shocked and quickly looked back. He saw Mason was surrounded by 2 bone rats and fell to the ground. Zack and Sham didn't watch the show. They stepped forward and punched and kicked the 2 bone rat. They didn't dare to attack with their daggers for fear of accidentally hurting Mason. Dean's face changed. He quickly pulled out his dagger and rushed over. "Fuck off!" Dean roared and kicked one of the bonebiter rats in the head with his metal boot. With a bang, the bonebiter rat's body fell backward. Zack saw the opportunity and quickly rushed forward, pressing the mouse on top of his body, raised his fist and fiercely pounded its head. Sham grabbed the tail of the other bone rat and didn't let it climb to Mason's face. Dean had already grasped the experience of dealing with it. He bent down and pulled up the hind leg of the bone-biter mouse. He pulled it up directly, swung it hard, and smashed it on the ground. Its sharp little head hit the ground, and the strength of its struggle suddenly weakened. Dean roared and smashed it again and again. He repeatedly smashed it so that the bone rat couldn't find a point to break free from his palm. After a dozen consecutive smashes, the bone rat gradually stopped moving. Its body twitched reflexively. Blood oozed from its hair and stained the ground. At this time, Mason climbed up from the ground and cooperated with Zack to stab the other bone rat to death. Dean looked at the motionless bone rat in his hand. He grabbed his dagger and stabbed it a few times. He was relieved and sat on the ground. He felt that his arm was sore as if it was broken. His whole body was exhausted. He was so tired that he kept gasping for breath. The air filtered by the mask was very slow. It made him feel suffocated and dizzy. Mason also sat next to him. He leaned back on Dean's back and gasped for breath. Zack and Sham were in a better state. They still had a lot of physical strength, but looking at the bodies of the bone rats on the ground, they were still frightened and pale. After resting for a while, Mason patted the hair caught between the gaps of his gloves. He gasped. "It was damn dangerous. It almost cut my throat. These damn things." Dean's breathing gradually became smooth. He looked back at him and said, "This time thanks to you." Mason snapped, "What are you talking about?" Dean smiled and no longer said anything. Zack said with lingering fear, "There are so many bone rats here. Didn't the hunters see them? Is it called cleaning?" Sham said, "Fortunately, our soft armor was tough and didn't get torn. Otherwise, the consequences would be unimaginable." Dean looked at the rat corpse in front of his feet and recalled his previous battle. His fingers couldn't help but clench his fists. Too bad, his performance was too bad. If Macon hadn't shouted in time, he would have been attacked by the rat from behind. "You've already done very well. After all, this is the first time you've encountered a battle like this. Even an adult would panic when they see an ordinary dog pouncing at them." While he was blaming himself, another voice in his heart was comforting him. But soon, Dean strangled this weak voice. He tightly bit his lips. The pain invaded his mind. He wanted to let his weakness remember that he only had one life. In the face of death, excellence and failure were meaningless. The only thing that could save him was the strength to live. He suddenly understood why the scavengers would only choose from the residential area and the slums, and not from the commercial area's colleges. Because the mortality rate of this job was too high. Although they encountered danger this time, mainly because they came to the 8th area that had just been cleaned. If they went to the 9th area that had been scavenged 10 times, the probability of encountering these monsters would be very low. However, the low probability of danger also meant that the harvest of scavenging was low. This was a dangerous and valuable profession. This was very fair. After the previous battle experience, Dean's heart still had some fear of death. This time they encountered a rat. Would they encounter a more terrible monster next time? Should he follow the group and obediently go back after the mission is over? He looked at the broken glass door of the supermarket. His heart was filled with retreat. But soon, he thought of his right arm and the scar on it. His eyes suddenly became firm. He climbed up with his palm on the ground and said to Mason and the other two, "Go in." There was such a big movement just now. The few inside should have come out. But maybe there are still some hiding in the dark. Everyone be careful. Mason, Zack and Sham didn't expect Dean to dare to enter the ruins. They were a little surprised. When they saw his determined eyes, they hesitated for a moment and stood up. They clenched their daggers and were ready to resist the attack. At this time, suddenly, a shrill scream came from the nearby street. It was especially loud in the decaying ruins. Dean and the other three were surprised. They suddenly thought of the rats that they had just encountered. Hearing this shrill scream, there was no doubt that the other side had encountered something. For a time, they hesitated. They didn't know whether they should go to help or not. Dean was aware of the hesitation in his heart. He thought for a moment and said, "Go and have a look. Be careful. If there is a situation, immediately withdraw." Mason and the other two were hesitant. When they heard his words, they immediately nodded. It was as if a stone fell from their hearts. They ran toward the direction of the scream. At this time, they saw other scavengers also rushed out of other buildings and ran toward the place where the scream came from. Soon, the scream was getting closer and closer. It was a street corner. Dean immediately slowed down and made a slight gesture. Mason, Zack and Sham immediately understood. They slowed down their pace and slowly followed behind Dean. Around the corner, Dean looked out. His pupils shrank and his face was full of horror. He saw the center of the green vegetated street. In front of a broken shop, two figures were twisting on the ground. One was a man and the other was a woman. However, the figure's clothes were tattered, revealing gray and thin skin. Her hair was disheveled and her fingers had turned into sharp claws. It was an undead. A living undead. At this moment, the female undead was lying on the struggling young man's body. She was gnawing the flesh on his chest. With Dean's vision, he could see it very clearly. He could even see the blood vessels that were constantly gushing out from the young man's chest. The young man's mouth and neck were dyed red. At the young man's feet, there was a black figure. It was a woman. Her body was motionless and seemed to be dead. Chapter 49. Aaron, Aaron, save me! At this time, the young man who was bitten was lying on the ground. He raised his head and raised his hand to grab the frightened young man behind him. His face was full of fear and pain, as well as the desire for life. The young man called Aaron covered his mouth and looked at his friend. Tears flowed down his face. His body trembled slightly. He clenched his teeth and turned back. He strode toward the exit of the street. Dean immediately saw that the undead that was biting the young man seemed to be alarmed by his footstep. It raised its head. Its disheveled face was full of ferociousness. It suddenly abandoned the food under its body and chased after Aaron. Its running posture was extremely twisted. Its arms were waving wildly, and its body was swaying unsteadily like a drunkard who could fall at any time. However, its speed was extremely fast. In its swaying pace, it seemed to have found a strange inertia and quickly caught up with Alan. Aaron heard the movement behind him. He looked back in horror. He suddenly saw the sharp claws of the undead slanting down like a few sharp daggers. He was scared and hurriedly raised his dagger to block. Although he was able to parry the claws of the undead, he was hit by the heavy force and fell to the ground. Seeing this scene, Dean was shocked. At the same time, there was a bit of panic in his heart. If he encountered such an undead monster alone, with his current physique, he would definitely die. At the moment, there was a bit of a feeling of relief in his heart. Fortunately, he did not choose this street. Otherwise, he and Mason would be the ones to end up like this. Seeing that the young man was gradually unable to resist, Dean suddenly had the intention to retreat. The previous idea of saving people had already been thrown to the back of his mind. Although these consortium scavengers were not formal graduates, but they had participated in many scavenging activities. The number of blessings they got was far more than them. Their strength was also several times stronger than them. At the moment, they were also unable to deal with the undead. Dean turned back and waved his hand, motioning them to leave. Mason and others were standing in the back. Although they didn't see the scene inside, they heard the screams and chewing sounds. After all, the ruins were too quiet, and the sound transmission was particularly clear. At this moment, seeing Dean's gesture, their faces suddenly changed. Recalling the previous encounter with the rats, they quickly and slowly retreated. At this time, from the other side of the street, there were 4 consortium scavengers who heard the sound and strode over. They were startled when they saw Dean and the others on the other side of the street. Suddenly they heard screams coming from the corner. The handsome youth's face changed as he rushed out and saw a horrifying scene. The youth called Alan was bitten on the arm by the undead woman. His black soft armor didn't resist the latter's sharp teeth. Blood oozed out from the bite and slid down the black armor. Undead! The handsome young man's pupils constricted. He was a little shocked, but he did not retreat. He shouted, "Hold on!" Then he turned to his 3 companions and said, "Let's go together and pin it down. Wait for the others and Scott to come." The 3 companions were also horrified, but they didn't hesitate. They held their daggers and rushed toward the undead led by the handsome young man. When the undead woman heard the sound, she looked up at them. Her blood-stained gray face revealed a ferocious expression. She roared and stood up in the same weird twisted posture as before. She waved her arms irregularly and rushed towards the handsome youth and the others. The handsome young man roared. He jumped up and kicked the undead's chest. Bang! He kicked the undead's chest. She flew backward and fell to the ground. Dean didn't rush to leave when he saw the 4 of them. He went back to the corner to continue to observe. When he saw the handsome young man kick the undead, he couldn't help but be happy. However, he didn't rush to help. The undead's agility made him feel a lingering fear. Mason and the other 2 people saw someone coming to fight. They went behind Dean and looked. They were shocked. When the handsome young man kicked the undead, the other 3 people immediately came forward to drag Alan on the ground. They pulled him back and left the battlefield. At this time, the undead's body quickly climbed up. She roared hoarsely and rushed toward the handsome young man. The handsome young man was aghast. He hurriedly swung his dagger. Puff! The dagger cut into the undead woman's arm and cut into the gray skin. However, there was no blood flowing out of the skin. From the cut surface, it seemed that there was black and red flesh inside, as if the blood had solidified. This caused the undead woman's body to be extremely hard. When the dagger cut halfway, it seemed to be stuck in the bones inside. The handsome young man's pupils shrank. He held the hilt and pulled hard, but he couldn't pull it out for a while. At this time, the undead woman took advantage of this short moment to pounce on his body. She raised her other arm and clawed at his throat. With a puff sound, the claw suddenly pierced the artery on the side of his neck. Blood gushed out and splashed on the arm of the undead woman. Vickers! The 3 people who dragged Alan from behind ran to help. They saw this scene and cried out. The handsome young man clutched his pierced neck and widened his eyes. It seemed that he did not expect his young life to end here. He raised his head with difficulty and looked at the horrifying face in front of him. His eyes gradually dimmed. The undead growled and grabbed his body. She bit his other neck and gnawed on his body. Monster! One of the stout companions roared in grief and indignation. He held the dagger and rushed toward the undead. The undead pushed the handsome young man's body away when she heard the voice. She swayed her body and rushed toward the stout young man. Peas, no, don't go! The 2 companions behind hurriedly shouted. But the pudgy youth's eyes had already turned red. He rushed up and stabbed with his dagger. Puff! The dagger pierced through the chest of the undead woman, who had no intention of dodging. He was startled for a moment. It seemed that he didn't expect to be killed so easily. But there was no joy in his heart. Instead, he was more sad. At this moment, the claws of the undead suddenly tore. One of the sharp claws of the index finger penetrated the cheeks of the stout middle-aged man. The tip of the claw pierced through the other cheek of the stout middle-aged man. The severe pain made the stout young man want to call out. But he was too frightened to call out. The next moment, he saw the hideous face approaching him and then, biting his face. Peas! One of the companions cried out in grief. The other one pulled him and hurriedly retreated. He hoped to take advantage of the time when the stout young man was eaten to escape as far as possible. Dean's face also changed color. He didn't expect that the 4 consortia scavengers couldn't fight against the undead. The most terrible thing was that the dagger had pierced her chest, but it didn't affect her at all. Was she really an immortal monster? Suddenly, He thought of the undead woman who had died in the bathroom and the other corpses on the road. Along the way, he didn't just look for supplies. Instead, he paid more attention to these corpses. He suddenly thought that these corpses had one thing in common. That was, there were scars on their heads. Sword wounds or arrow wounds. Obviously, they were left by hunters. Chapter 50. As Dean was thinking, a lot of footsteps came from behind. He looked back and saw Scott and Mia with a large number of scavengers. Scott and Mia were running in front of the others. Their speed was extremely amazing. They were like human-shaped cheetahs. In the blink of an eye, they crossed hundreds of meters and arrived in front of Dean. "What's going on?" Scott asked in a hurry. Dean saw them appear. His tense heart loosened. "Undead!" He pointed to the corner of the street. Scott and Mia's expression changed. When they turned their heads to look, they saw the two scavengers dragging the unconscious Alan out of the street. They also saw Scott. Their sad faces were full of surprise. "Help! There's an undead! Save Peas!" Scott and Mia hurriedly ran over and immediately saw the scene of the undead woman gnawing the chunky young man. Their faces changed. Scott immediately pulled out his dagger and said, "Prepare to fight and kill it together. Otherwise, it will keep following the smell we left behind." At this time, Mia saw the unconscious Alan. Her pretty face turned pale. She trembled. What's his injury?" One of them said, "He was bitten by the undead. We rushed over and saw him resisting." Scott's face changed as he heard this. He gritted his teeth. "Kill him before he is infected. Otherwise, we will have to face two undead." The two scavengers' faces turned ugly. They were not rookies who were scavengers. They already knew that if they were bitten by the monsters outside the giant wall, they would be infected. However, knowing was one thing, but to kill a scavenging companion with his own hands, a living person, it was really hard for him to harden his heart. "Can't we save him?" One of the tall scavengers looked at Scott. "Maybe he can hold on, stupid." Scott interrupted him. His face was full of anger. "If you want to die, then leave with him or kill him immediately." At this time, the other youth trembled. "The undead is coming." Scott quickly focused his attention and stared at the undead woman. He saw that she had abandoned the prey in her hands and her green eyes fell on them. She shook her body and attacked them at an incredible speed. So fast. Scott was shocked, but he did not retreat. He gritted his teeth and charged forward. With a bang, Scott took the lead and kicked the undead woman's abdomen. The latter didn't dodge and was immediately kicked to the ground. Scott seized the opportunity and quickly approached it. Seeing that it was getting up from the ground, he immediately kicked it in the face. The tip of the steel boot hit its chin, kicking it over again. "Die!" Scott growled and raised his dagger to stab the undead woman's face. Puff! The dagger pierced through the center of the undead woman's face. The undead woman's throat issued a dry roar. Her body twitched violently. She kept twisting and struggling on the ground, but her head was nailed to the ground by Scott. After struggling for a while, she gradually stopped moving. Seeing this, Scott was relieved. He slowly pulled out the dagger from the bones of the undead's cheek. He held the dagger tightly. When he pulled it out, the undead's head was lifted off the ground. It was as if the undead had come back to life. The two youths watching from behind were startled. Dudian saw this scene and immediately knew that his guess was right. At this time, other scavengers also rushed over. They saw several bloody corpses on the scene. Their faces became very ugly. At this time, Scott turned around and looked at the two youths. He couldn't help but angrily said, "Do you want to die? If he wakes up, the first thing he will do is to bite you." After he finished speaking, he walked up to the two of them with his bloody sword. He lowered his head and looked at Alan, who was being held by them. He took a deep breath, clenched his teeth, and stabbed his sword through Alan's throat. He twisted the sword and cut off Alan's head. Blood gushed out like a fountain. The two youths' faces were pale. Their legs were weak. They kept retreating. Scott coldly looked at them. He shook the blood off his dagger and said in a cold voice, "This is the law of survival outside the giant wall. You won't be able to learn it from the instructor. Either you adapt or you die." As he spoke, he glanced at Mia, who was standing at the side with her head lowered. He sighed and turned to the other scavengers. "Light a fire and burn the bodies here. Don't let the smell of blood attract other monsters that haven't been cleaned up." Many of these scavengers were newcomers. At the moment they saw such a cruel picture, their faces turned pale and they kept retreating. One of the short children said in horror, I want to go home. I don't want to scavenge anymore. I don't want money." Then, he turned around and ran away. Scott angrily said, "Get him back for me." 2 consortium scavengers immediately chased after him. At this time, one of the scavengers suddenly raised his trembling hand and pointed to the back of Scott. "Boss, they stood up." Everyone was surprised and hurried to look. Dudian immediately saw that in the shop in the distance, the young man who was bitten first and the other female scavenger next to him were struggling to sit upright. At the same time, their heads looked up at the sky as if their cervical vertebrae were fractured. Then under everyone's gaze, their heads slowly twisted stiffly, as if the tissues inside were rapidly adapting. "Damn." Scott's face was ugly. He growled, "Everyone get ready to go with me." He took the lead and rushed forward. Mia gritted her teeth and took the lead to keep up. The other consortium scavengers hesitated for a moment, but quickly caught up with them. As for the newcomers who were in the same group as Dean, they stared blankly at the scene. Some of them fell to the ground as their legs went soft. Dudian had seen Scott's skills. He estimated that Scott and Mia should be able to deal with the 2 transformed undead. He immediately clenched his dagger and followed. Mason, Zack and Sham saw Dudian rush out and quickly pulled him. "Are you crazy?" Dudian quickly said. "I'm going to destroy the other 2 corpses so that they won't be transformed into undeads." The 3 immediately said, "I'll go too." The 4 of them ran behind the consortium scavengers and came to the corpses. The 2 corpses belonged to the handsome youth and the chunky youth. Dudian looked at the corpses in front of his feet. He hesitated for a moment but clenched his teeth and used his dagger to cut their neck. After all, he had been enhanced twice. His strength was twice that of an ordinary adult. His sharp short sword cut through their vertebrae in an instant. Dean's heart was pounding wildly. Although he knew that they were dead, he still had a sense of guilt and fear when he slashed at them. His hand holding the dagger trembled slightly, and he kept comforting himself in his heart. At this moment, he suddenly heard a scream of horror coming from the front. He hurriedly looked back. The dozen consortium scavengers in front, including Scott and Mia, were all horrified. They turned around and fled in their direction. Chapter 51. This, so many. Dean and Mason couldn't help but be scared. At this time, Scott, who was running in the front, saw that they were still in a daze, and suddenly roared, "Run!" Dean woke up and hurriedly turned around and ran. Mason, Zack, and Shaw quickly followed him. They ran like crazy. They wished they could grow 2 more legs. However, the gap between their physique and figure was finally reflected at this moment. Scott and Mia quickly passed them and ran towards the left side of the corner. They soon disappeared from the sight of Dean and the others. At this time, the other consortium scavengers also caught up. Get out of here!" A burly youth roared at Dean and others. He pushed Sham, who was the last one to fall. Puff! Sham was pushed to the side, and because of his fall, he tripped several youths who were rushing over. For a time, 4 or 5 people fell to the ground, and everyone was desperately trying to climb up. Dean heard Sham's screams and quickly stopped. He looked back and saw Sham's cheeks were bruised and fell to the ground. He had just climbed up, but another youth used his hand to press his head down. The youth stood up and quickly ran away. Hundreds of meters behind them, more than a dozen undeads were chasing them. Dean's face was pale, His fists were tightly clenched, and his heart was beating so fast that it was deafening. He fiercely clenched his teeth and ran back to the front of Sham. He grabbed his arm and shouted, "Get up!" Sham hurriedly grabbed him. Dean immediately turned and continued to run. At this time, the other consortium scavengers had already run in front of them. They followed the direction of Scott and Mia and disappeared around the corner. Sham looked back and saw more than a dozen bloodthirsty undeads behind him. His scalp tingled, his legs trembled, and he almost tripped again. At this time, Mason and Zack also turned and rushed over. They hurriedly grabbed Sham's body and dragged him forward. "Go to the right side." Soon, several people came to the corner. Dean gritted his teeth and said. Mason and the other two were startled, but there was no time to ask. They could only follow Dean and run to the right. At this time, Dean bit his palm and blood oozed out. He took a deep breath and grabbed a gravel from the ground. He spat the blood from his mouth and turned towards the direction where Scott, Mia and the others had left. He threw the gravel towards the direction where Scott, Mia and the others had left. Dong dong! The stone fell to the ground in a parabola and rolled a few times. At this time, they were already more than 30 meters away from the corner. The undead chasing them just came to the direction of the corner. As soon as they stepped out, they saw the stone flying in front of them. The next moment, the undead roared and chased in the direction of the stone. The few walking corpses behind it immediately followed it and chased after it. However, there was an undead among them. It seemed to be aware of Dean and the others on the right side and chased after them. Dean's face changed. He hurriedly glanced at both sides of the street. He suddenly saw more than 10 meters in front of him. There was a gate of a community. There was a small shop covered with vegetation in front of the door. He immediately said, "Come with me." He ran to the community. As soon as he ran over, he saw a few corpses lying on the ground. The security room in front of the door had long been corroded by moss. From a few exposed glass windows, he could vaguely see a humanoid shadow standing inside. Dean didn't dare to look again. He quickly stepped over the corpses on the ground and rushed to the nearest building. The security door under the building was not locked. It was slightly open. There was a corpse on the doorstep. Judging from the clothes, it was also an undead. Dean resisted the trembling in his heart. He stepped on the back of the undead and entered the back door. He looked back and said to Mason and the other two, "Come in." The three of them saw the corpse at the door. Their faces were a little pale, but they still resisted the fear and jumped over it. At this time, Dean saw that the previous undead had caught up with them, and behind it, there were two more undead. Dean's face changed. Dean's face changed. He hurriedly grabbed the door and wanted to lock it, but he found that the bolt had long been covered with moss. He immediately gave up trying to lock it. Looking back, the building was dark. There was an elevator in front of him. At the moment, the elevator door was half open. It was also covered with moss and vegetation. There were several corpses lying inside. Some were undead, and some were decayed human skeletons. The bones were dark, like rusty black iron. Dean's face was ugly. He immediately ran down the stairs and said, "Keep up." Mason and the other two quickly followed him. When Dean entered the building, he looked at the height of the building. It was at least 15 floors. He went straight up the stairs. Along the way, he saw 7 or 8 corpses, rotten human skeletons and dog skeletons. When he ran to the 6th floor, Dean was tired and out of breath. The same was true of Mason and the other two. In fact, the previous battle with the rats had almost exhausted their physical strength. At this moment, they were completely frightened and ran away, breaking their physical limit. Roar, roar! At this time, a hoarse roar came from the bottom of the floor. The sound was approaching rapidly. Dean looked down along the staircase handrail. He suddenly saw several gray palms grabbing the handrail and climbing along the stairs. However, the climbing speed was obviously blocked. Nevertheless, Seeing that they were still approaching, Dean's face became more and more ugly. He gritted his teeth and continued to climb up. Soon, Dean came to the 12th floor. He was tired and panting. He heard the unconscious roar of the undead. It was more than 10 meters below. He estimated that they should be about 3 floors away from him. He was about to continue to go up. Suddenly, Sham pointed to an open room next to him. He gasped, "Dean, we should hide in here. They should not open the door." Dean was startled. He immediately reacted and said, "Go in." He took the lead and went in. Mason and the other two immediately followed. Dean locked the door. Because of the high floor, the moss and vegetation didn't climb up, so the latch was easy to lock. Dean twisted the latch and locked it. Then he quickly glanced back at the house. He saw that the living room was very messy. There was a rotten corpse lying on the ground. There was a stroller next to it. There was a baby's corpse inside. Dean immediately said, "Move the sofa inside and block the door. Be gentle." "Sofa?" Macon and the others didn't understand, but when they saw the direction of Dean's finger, they understood what he was talking about. They immediately ran over. The 3 of them lifted the sofa and quickly moved it to the door. They gently put it down and put it against the door. At this time, the roar outside the door was getting clearer. Dean hurriedly made a silent gesture. He stood on the sofa and looked out through the peephole. The peephole was extremely cloudy. Dean immediately saw a few blurred figures appear from outside the door. It was the previous undead. The 3 undead seemed to climb the stairs out of inertia. They continued to climb up the stairs. Dean was relieved, but his heart was still pounding. He was only 1 door away from the bloodthirsty monster, but he felt that the world seemed to be still, and only his strong heartbeat echoed in his ears. Roar. Chapter 52. Dean was scared and hurriedly pressed against the door. The door lock was old and rusty. It fell off from the door frame under the first punch of the undead. Fortunately, there was a sofa cushioning it so it wasn't directly pushed open. Mason and the other 2 were scared and rushed to push the sofa. The result was that the sofa cracked from the middle. The wooden frame of the sofa had long been rotten. It couldn't withstand the gravity, and suddenly turned into debris. At the same time, with a bang, the door was broken, and a gray and pale palm stretched in, grabbing randomly. Fortunately, it was an adult undead, and it was much taller than Dean, so it didn't catch Dean behind the door. Dean was pale. He forgot that the building had been corroded for 300 years and had long been dilapidated. He clenched his teeth and said to Mason and the other 2, "Jump from the window and go to the next floor." Mason and the other 2 were panicking. But after all, they had undergone 3 years of training. They quickly responded. Mason said, "I'll help you. You go first." "Go!" Dean roared. The 3 slightly gritted their teeth and no longer said anything. They came to the side of the window and looked down. The height of 12 floors made them feel dizzy. But at the moment there was no retreat. Sham was the most meticulous. He glanced at the object mounted on the wall outside the balcony. He said, "We should be able to grab the balcony of the next floor if we step on it." It was an air conditioner box. Mason was the most courageous among the 3. He looked at it. Although he was worried about its firmness, he clenched his teeth and took the lead to jump. Bang! The air conditioner couldn't bear his weight and suddenly collapsed. Macon was so scared that his heart stopped beating. But he was prepared for it. He hurriedly stepped on the falling air conditioner and used it to grab the balcony of the lower floor. The falling air conditioner fell vertically. After smashing several air conditioners in a row, it fell straight into the grass at the edge of the community. It made a loud noise. Mason clenched his teeth and climbed to the balcony. He looked back at Sham and Zack. They had no leverage, so they could only jump straight down. Mason shouted, "I will catch you, Sham, you jump first." Sham was the thinnest and lightest of the 3. He hesitated for a moment as he looked at the open arms of Macon. He jumped down. Mason quickly grabbed Sham's body, but the inertia of the fall almost took him off the balcony. He felt a tearing pain in his arm, but he still tightly grabbed Sham, gritted his teeth, and pulled him to the balcony. Sham was still in a state of shock. He almost thought that he would die. He looked at Macon's painful face. His heart was filled with gratitude and guilt. At this time, Zack hurriedly said, "Are you ready? I'm going to jump." Mason shook his arm and said to Sham, "Let's catch him together." Sham nodded. Both of them opened their arms and said to Zack, "Jump." Zack slightly gritted his teeth and jumped down. Macon and Sham spread out their hands and immediately caught Zack. Macon's arm was in pain. He almost slipped and let go of Zack. He was scared and pale. When the three of them jumped to the balcony, Dean couldn't resist the push of the three undeads outside. The door that was once strong but now as fragile as paper was smashed by the three undeads. He abandoned the door. He knew that Macon and the others went to the balcony of the room. He immediately turned to the other side of the kitchen. Along the way, he lifted the table and the TV on the table to the center of the living room, trying to slow down the speed of the undead. Although the speed of the undeads was far faster than him, but their brains didn't seem to be very good. They didn't know how to avoid. They suddenly tripped over the TV and the table on the ground. At this time, Dean seized the opportunity to run to the kitchen. He threw the kitchen knives and plates on the table at the undead. The damage caused was minimal, but he succeeded in attracting all of them. Dean hurried to the bathroom next to the kitchen. He closed the door without any defense. He looked at the ventilation window of the toilet. It was made of aluminum alloy, but the edges had long been rotten. After 300 years of baptism, even the walls of the whole building were peeling off layers of bubble-like soil. He didn't say anything. He stepped on the toilet and lifted his foot to kick it. Bang! The window was suddenly kicked open. The narrow window was just enough to accommodate his body. If he was an adult, it would be somewhat difficult. However, when he stretched his head and looked out of the window, the height of the 12-story building, the moss-covered cars on the street, like a small steamed bun, made him dizzy. However, the roar behind him was fast approaching. Even without looking back, Dean knew that the three undeads had climbed up and rushed over. He could only jump. He gritted his teeth and jumped. There was no air conditioner on the outside wall. After all, no one would install air conditioner outside the bathroom. There were 2 white pipes on the smooth porcelain wall. Most of them were the pipes used for toilet excretion. Dean had already noticed it. When he jumped, he grabbed the water pipe. Bang! The water pipe was like a piece of paper. It was immediately crushed by him. The water pipe below was also pulled down by him. Dean's face changed dramatically. He hurriedly inserted his backhand. With a loud thud, the short sword in his hand stabbed into the wall and stopped his falling body. Dean's heart fell a little. When he saw that the door and the sofa were vulnerable, he thought of the previous scavenging. He saw some sword marks left on the wall by the hunters. As a result, he bet right. The wall was no longer strong, and the sword could cut a huge gap. Roar! Roar! At this time, 2 ferocious heads popped out of the toilet window. 2 undeads were lying on the window, clawing at him. Above them, another undeads rushed over. The body of the undeads squeezed crazily. The wall next to the window was squeezed like mud. Looking at its crazy appearance, Dean, who had just saved his life, could not help but be shocked. His pupils suddenly shrank. He thought of a terrible possibility. He hurriedly looked down. It was only 1 meter away from the toilet window on the next floor. If there were 2 daggers at this time, he could easily use each other to climb to the next floor. But at this moment there was only 1 dagger in his hand. Once it was pulled out, it would fall immediately. Dean gritted his teeth and looked at the windowsill more than 1 meter away from his feet. The windowsill was only half a palm wide. It was extremely difficult to jump and required great courage. However, looking at the body of the 3rd undeads that kept squeezing out, Dean did not dare to wait any longer. His body swayed slightly, and he suddenly jumped. With a whoosh, his body fell quickly, and the soles of his feet stepped on the windowsill of the toilet. However, because of the wall, the soles of his feet could not step firmly. His toes rubbed a little, and his body continued to jump down. This short distance made Dean feel as if his head had exploded, and some blankness. The next moment, his palms suddenly stretched out, and at the moment of falling, he grabbed the windowsill. At that moment, it seemed that he was alive again. Dean looked at the undeads that had squeezed out more than half of their bodies. He hurriedly raised his other hand and smashed the window. Bang! The window was immediately smashed. The glass fragments pierced his fist, and blood dripped. He did not feel the pain for a while. His palm grasped the edge of the glass fragments, and quickly climbed up and drilled through the window. Whoosh! Just as he drilled in, a gust of wind rolled up behind him. Dean hurriedly looked down and saw that the undeads finally squeezed out of the toilet window, fell straight down, and fell into the grass on the edge of the downstairs. At this time, because of the squeezing of the undeads, the space for the other two undeads suddenly increased. Dean immediately saw that one of the undeads was lying on the body of the other undeads, roaring and grabbing him. Dean was startled. Could it be that these undeads only knew how to attack and had no self-protection consciousness? Dean hurriedly retracted his arm to avoid being caught, otherwise he would have been dragged down. At this time, the last remaining undead occupied a large window and easily struggled out. It followed and fell straight down. Then there were two loud sounds, which were particularly clear in this quiet community. Dean breathed a sigh of relief and looked out of the window. He saw 3 undeads falling into the grass downstairs, stacked together. In vain, the undeads at the top twisted slightly and staggered to stand up again. Dean's face changed. He didn't expect that it wouldn't die from such a fall. He patted his head and forgot that this monster could only be killed by destroying its head. Falling from the height of 12 floors would only make its body a little more broken. At this time, he saw the undeads shaking their body and looked up at Dean. They opened their mouth and roared. Then they suddenly climbed to the wall. 2 sharp claws fiercely clasped the wall, as if climbing a rock. $#. Do you think you are Spider-Man? Dean almost vomited blood. Fortunately, he did not go upstairs but chose to go downstairs. Otherwise, he could not stop them. Mason and the other 2 came to the window and looked at the fast-climbing undead. Their faces changed. Dean did not panic. After the previous process of jumping from the 12th floor to the 11th floor, he felt as if he had died once. Later, he was aware of the weakness of these undeads. In his heart, he was no longer afraid of these undeads. "Give me the sword," Dean said coldly. Mason immediately understood what he was going to do and quickly handed him the sword. Dean held the dagger and looked at the walking dead that was climbing fast against the wall. He looked at the gray middle-aged face approaching, but his heart no longer trembled. Instead, he became calmer. When the walking dead was half a meter away from the window, he suddenly stabbed the dagger. Puff! The dagger accurately pierced through the walking dead's eye socket and directly penetrated the soft brain tissue. The undead's body trembled. Its body seemed to suddenly lose its strength and fell down. Bang! It hit the 2 undeads below. The 2 undeads did not move. They seemed to be dead. Dean glanced at them and found that because they were in a downward posture, their heads fell to the ground, causing their skulls to crack and die on the spot. The 3rd undeads fell on their bodies and got a body cushion, so it did not directly fall to death. At the moment, the 3 undeads were all solved. Dean's heart was relieved. He felt a burst of soreness in his body. From the fight with the rats until now, the continuous strenuous exercise had completely overdrawn his physical strength. He immediately sat on the toilet and looked at the 3 people in front of him. He gasped and smiled. "Are you hurt?" Mason shook his head and sighed. "There is no one to save us. When you are also in trouble, let us save you." Dean laughed. "Go to hell, don't curse me." After surviving a disaster, the tense nerves of several people relaxed. One by one, regardless of the dirty ground, sat on the ground to rest. "Do you think Scott and the others will be okay?" Zack said. Dean suddenly thought of his previous action of throwing stones to lead the group of undeads to them. He could not help but change his face. At that time, the situation was critical. He did not think that he would do such a thing. He thought about it carefully. Perhaps when he saw the consortium scavengers push down Sham, he was too angry and made such a move. Or perhaps the deepest part of his heart was evil. Dean shook his head slightly and no longer thought about it. He said, "Take a break and then go to find them." The faces of the three people changed. Sham suddenly said, "You say, how can there suddenly be so many undeads? Wasn't it cleaned by the hunters? Is this the so-called cleaning?" Dean slightly frowned. He also felt puzzled about this. If it was to leave the rats, he could understand. After all, in a head-on fight, the scavengers did not lose to the rats. Moreover, the rats were hiding in the sewers, so it was really difficult to kill. But these undeads were different. The strength and speed of the scavengers were not on the same level. Even if 10 people besieged one, they would suffer heavy losses, let alone leaving so many. They should have been ignored by the hunters, or they came from another area. Dean pondered. Mason and the other 2 people were startled and did not say anything. After a moment, Dean felt that he had enough rest. He patted the dust on his buttocks and stood up. Looking at the dagger on the wall outside the window, he was distressed. Without the dagger, it would be extremely dangerous to encounter any monsters. He thought about it and searched the room. As a result, he found that the quilts and clothes left here were all torn like pieces of paper. He suddenly saw vines crawling outside the wall. He immediately used Mason's dagger to cut off a string and twisted it into a rope. He threw it to the hilt of the dagger nailed to the wall. After several attempts, he finally pulled the dagger out from the wall. Dean was relieved when he took back the dagger. At this time, he heard Sham's panicked voice, "Dean, come here." Dean was surprised and hurried to the windowsill where Sham was lying. He immediately saw that on the street outside the community, there were more than a dozen undeads wandering over. They did not go along the street but turned into the community. Although he wasn't completely sure about this speculation, but he felt that it was the most likely one based on the current information. He looked at the undeads that were gradually approaching downstairs. Suddenly, he had an idea. He looked at Macon and the other 2. "Macon, you find something hard and throw it to other places. See if you can use sound to distract them. Zack, you immediately ignite a torch." The 3 of them were surprised, but their eyes lit up. Although they didn't know the purpose of making a torch, but using sound to distract the undeads was a good idea. "Let me do it." Macon immediately ran to the room to search. He broke off a few mud-like bricks from the bedroom wall. He went to the previous kitchen and threw them toward the building. Bang! The bricks fell to the ground and turned into powder. The sound spread in the quiet neighborhood. The shaking undeads were immediately attracted to the sound. Macon was excited to see the method working. He continued to throw the torch. Moreover, he threw farther and farther away so that the undeads would be far away. Dean was relieved to see that the sound was effective. He saw that Zack was also using the fire scythe to ignite the clothes in the room to make a torch. He immediately said, "Throw the torch and see." Zack froze for a moment. He couldn't figure out what Dean was thinking. But he still listened to him and threw the torch. The flame rolled in the air and fell to the ground, almost extinguished. Dean immediately looked closely. He saw the sound of the torch falling on the ground. Several undeads who were running behind turned back. But Macon threw the brick again, causing a huge sound. The undeads were attracted to the direction of the brick. Soon they left the community and came to the street where the brick fell. Dean suddenly felt strange. Did he guess wrong? He frowned and looked at the undeads who were attracted by the sound. He thought that it was wrong. Anyway, it was good to lead the undeads away. At this time, the distance of the stones thrown by Macon had reached the limit. The undeads wandered around the place where the stones fell. They wandered for a moment and suddenly staggered toward the neighborhood. Dean and the other three were relieved. But they suddenly widened their eyes and almost cursed out loud. What's the situation? Dean was a little surprised. They had been led away, so why were they still so persistent in drilling into this community? And looking at the direction of the undeads, they were still in this building. The only difference between this building and the other buildings was that there were 4 of them. How could this be? Sham was stunned. Sham hurriedly said, "Hurry up and continue to throw." Macon reacted and hurriedly ran to the wall to buckle the bricks and continue to throw. Soon, the wandering undeads were attracted. They were a little relieved, but their hearts were not happy. Using the sound to lure the undeads was not a long-term solution. Moreover, the time was long. Maybe the undeads from other places would be attracted. Dean frowned. What was it about them that attracted the undeads? Wait, if it is the heat. Can they distinguish the difference between the heat in the body and the flame? Dean suddenly thought of this. His face slightly changed. If this was the case, there was no other way but to reduce the heat in their body. However, to reduce the heat, they could only take off their clothes. However, the nuclear radiation in the air was strong. If they took off their clothes, the radiation value would increase rapidly. Dean bowed his head in contemplation. Mason and the other 2 took turns to throw the brick. Whenever the undead was ready to return to the community, they would throw a brick. The rhythm was very stable, and there was no random throwing. After a long while, Dean made a decision. He looked at Mason and the other 2. Who is willing to go down with me and bring up an undead? Hearing this, Mason and the other 2 were shocked. Bring the undead up? Dead or alive? What are you doing? The 3 that just died. Dean seriously said, I want to dissect them. The fastest way to understand something was to see it thoroughly from the inside out. Although Dean had no medical experience and did not know much about the human body, but in such a harsh environment, there were limited ways to try. This was the only way he could think of to understand the undead as soon as possible. Chapter 55. If you want to dissect, isn't there one here? Sham pointed to the living room. There was an old undead lying there. It should be the owner of the house. Dean shook his head slightly. I want to dissect the recently dead ones. I want to speculate from their behavior. As for the ones that have been killed by hunters, I will dissect them to see what changes will happen to their bodies after they die. I'll go with you. Zack gritted his teeth. Dean nodded slightly and immediately equipped his dagger. He pushed open the door and went down the corridor with Zack. One of the corridors collapsed, but it wasn't difficult for the 2 of them. They could directly jump over the first floor of the corridor. Soon, the 2 came to the ground floor and looked outside. They saw the undead were led away by Mason and Sham. They immediately opened the door and ran to the side of the corner. They immediately saw 3 corpses piled up on the ground. Although their heads were broken, there was no blood flowing out. Dean grabbed the undead that he had stabbed to death. He whispered to Zack to help. Zack's face was pale. No one wanted to get close to this terrible bloodthirsty monster. But he still resisted the fear in his heart and went forward to support the other arm of the undead. Dean was not worried about being infected with the virus and radiation of the undead. He carried it back to the building with Zack. The undead was heavier than Dean imagined. It looked like a skinny young man, but it felt like a fat man that weighed 200 or 300 pounds. Fortunately, he had been blessed twice. His strength was more than 3 times that of an adult. Otherwise, it would be extremely difficult to move the undead. Soon, the 2 of them moved the corpse to the floor where the stairs had collapsed, which was the 9th floor. Dean put down the undead and went to the room to check again. He didn't see any hidden rats or other dangers, so he moved the undead in. The original owner of the room had died, and the blood on the ground had long been covered with dust. There was the body of a teenage boy lying on the ground. Judging from the long nails, it was also an undead. Not far from the body of the boy, under the table, there was a corpse. The hair was very long, it was obviously a woman. The flesh and blood were rotten, and the corpse was also very dark due to the radiation. Dudeen went to the bedroom and took out some moldy and rotten quilt. He covered the corpses on the ground to cover the pungent smell of corpses. Then he asked Zack to sweep away the scattered items in the living room to make an open space. At this time, Sham saw that the two didn't return for a long time, so he ran down. He was relieved to see them in the room. But soon he looked at the undead in front of Dean's feet. He trembled. Really want to dissect it? Dean nodded firmly. If it was before today, he would never dare to dissect a human body. Did they rely on these eyes to track their prey? Dean was silent. He used the dagger to gently cut the end of the nose. Inch by inch, the raised nose was flattened, revealing two dark nostrils. Dean looked at it and slightly frowned. He turned its head sideways and cut off its ears. He dug a vortex with its ears as the center. This process made Zack and Sham pale. Their legs trembled. They were not afraid of the undead, but Dean's expression. It was a very focused, very serious expression. This kind of expression made them feel a heartfelt chill from the bottom of their hearts. They were more afraid than facing a living undead. Even after many years, they still could not forget this scene. At this time, Dean hollowed out the ears of the undead and immediately saw that the ears were full of thick dust. He felt strange in his heart. These undead had not dug out earwax for more than 300 years. Their ears had long been accumulated with layers of dust, just like stuffing ear cotton. Their hearing should be very weak. Why were they so sensitive to sound? Could it be that they had evolved a new organ to replace their sense of hearing? Dean pondered for a moment. He pushed the undead's chin and looked at its tongue. The tongue had long been broken. It seemed that it was stabbed when biting prey. It could be seen that the undead really did not know how to protect themselves. It also did not feel pain. Thinking of this, Dean was startled. He remembered that when Scott killed the undead, he used a dagger to nail the undead's head. The undead screamed and its body kept twitching. Since it did not feel pain, why did it have such a reaction? His eyes flashed for a moment. Suddenly, he waved the dagger and cut the undead's mouth from both sides. His palms pressed down hard. Soon, the undead's entire jaw was abruptly cut off by him, but there was still no trace of blood. Dean immediately cut off its head. From the cut of the chin, he looked inside the head. Inside was the upper cavity and cold flesh. He slightly frowned. He was somewhat embarrassed, but he remembered that there were two spare ones downstairs. He immediately clenched his teeth and used the dagger to stab inside. He rotated and stirred. The flesh and brain cells inside were crushed. Then he knocked the head on the floor to knock out all the crushed tissues. Suddenly, a hard object rolled out from the head. It fell to the ground and hit the shoulder of the undead. It was a thumb-sized, perfectly round dark blue ball. Chapter 56. Dean, Sham and Zack's eyes fell on the dark blue ball. They couldn't help but be startled. In the skull, a ball fell out? The ball was a natural perfect circle, and the color was dark blue. Obviously, it was not a hard skull tissue, but a blue metal ball. But how could there be metal in the brain? Dean was surprised, but he didn't touch it with his hand. Instead, he used his dagger to poke the ball. The dagger tip immediately slipped, and the ball rolled down to the broken neck of the undead. So hard. Dean's eyes moved. The activity of hard objects was poor, and the speed of infection was slow. Moreover, it would not penetrate like a liquid. He had gloves to isolate it, so a simple touch should not be a big deal. He immediately reached out and picked it up. As soon as he grabbed the dark blue ball, Dean's whole body quivered. There was only one feeling in his fingers: cold. Extremely cold. It was like holding an ice ball. He couldn't help but think of the frozen blood in the corpse. Was it because of this dark blue ball? At this time, the cold seemed to spread, climbing along the dark blue ball to Dean's arm. He felt the temperature of his whole arm was dropping rapidly, and it was a little stiff. He could not help but put the dark blue ball on the other hand. Soon, the other hand also felt a little frozen. At the same time, Dean felt cold all over his body, as if he was in the black snow season, extremely cold. How can it be? Even if both hands are holding a piece of ice, it's only the hands that are frozen. How can my whole body feel cold? I feel the cold from the soles of my feet. Dean was surprised. It was like playing with a snowball in winter. At most, the hands were cold, but the body was warm. But at the moment, he felt cold all over, as if his whole body was stuck to a piece of ice. He immediately put the dark blue ball on the ground, rubbed his hands together, and breathed. He felt a little warm, but soon he felt hungry. He had not eaten anything since he came out of the giant wall. He suppressed his hunger and looked at the dark blue ball in puzzlement. Suddenly, he thought of a reason. Heat absorption. Dean woke up. This dark blue ball will absorb heat, just like saltpeter in black gunpowder. Saltpeter is not only one of the raw materials of black gunpowder, but also can make ice. In this world, most alchemists have mastered the use of saltpeter to make ice, but they haven't found that saltpeter mixed with sulfur can explode. Saltpeter to make ice was because it absorbed the heat in the water, so the water turned into ice. Just now, he felt his whole body was cold. Obviously, this dark blue ball had the same heat absorption function as saltpeter. If he held it in his hand, it would absorb heat along the arm until the body heat was absorbed. Then the body temperature would drop. When it dropped to a certain level, the heartbeat would stop and the body would freeze to death. No wonder the body temperature of these undead are so low, so cold. It turned. No wonder this undead body temperature is so low, so cold. It was because of this thing. But how can it appear in the undead's brain? Dean was full of curiosity. If someone was implanted into their brain, then naturally it was impossible. After all, there were so many undead. How would it take a lot of energy and time to implant one by one? If it's not artificial, then it's its own growth. However, although the undead are virus-infected humans, after all, they are flesh and blood. How can they grow such a hard metal object and have such strange characteristics? Dean felt strange. At this time, a figure suddenly jumped down from the stairs. It immediately alarmed the few people in the room. When they saw that it was Macon, they were relieved. Mason was relieved when he saw that all three of them were there. He said, "Scared me to death. I almost thought that something happened to you down there." Sham scratched his head. "I was watching Dean's dissection. I forgot to inform you." Zack reacted and hurriedly said, "You came down. What about the undead?" Mason rolled his eyes and said, "Of course I came back. I'm tired. Who can replace me? I'll go." Sham looked at the head of the undead that was beheaded. He felt his stomach churning. Dean's thoughts were interrupted by Mason. He continued to think about it, but there was no clue. He could not help but sigh. He no longer continued to dwell on this aspect. The most important thing was to survive. Suddenly, his eyes lit up. He immediately said to Zack and Mason, "Come with me, let's go downstairs." Both of them had some doubts, but still followed. Dean went downstairs and saw that the group of undead outside had been led away. He immediately sneaked to the corner and cut off the heads of the two dead undead. Then he carried their heads back to the building. Mason and Zack immediately retreated. He smiled and said, "It's okay. They are dead." Mason was horrified. When did you become so bold?" "I'll adapt to it." Dean went back upstairs. According to the previous method, he split the heads of the two undead. Because the heads of the two undeads were already cracked, he easily cut them open. As he expected, there was an identical dark blue orb inside. When cutting the third head, Dean suddenly thought of a problem. He immediately stopped the previous rough cutting method. Instead, he slowly opened the head along the cracked position of the skull. Soon, he saw the inside of the skull. As he expected, the brain tissue was extremely cold, as if it had been frozen. The dark blue ball was lying in the brain tissue package. However, probably because the skull was cracked, the brain tissue in the dark blue ball was somewhat damaged. Dean carefully searched for a while and soon understood that this dark blue ball was the main reason for controlling the actions of the undead. The so-called destruction of the head could kill the undead. There were two principles. The first was to destroy the central nervous system in the head so that the head could not control the body. The second was to destroy the connection between the dark blue ball and the brain tissue in the head. In short, this dark blue ball was like an ovary in the brain tissue. It was not necessary to destroy the head to kill the undead. As long as there was a strong shock, the dark blue ball would be shaken out of the ovary of the brain tissue. The dark blue ball would lose contact with the nerves in the ovary wall. Then the undead would stop moving. In other words, the undead would be killed. After understanding this point, Dean was more and more puzzled. What was this dark blue ball? Why would it grow in the brain of the undead? Was it a virus? So, wasn't this dark blue ball a virus condensation? Thinking of this, Dean immediately picked up the dark blue ball and wrapped it into a fist-sized ball. He slightly relaxed and then handed two to Mason and Zach. This thing can absorb body temperature. It will help us to reduce body temperature. But don't hold it. It will absorb body temperature. It is best to put it in the backpack. Mason and Zach were surprised to see the two things wrapped in layers. Mason curiously asked, "What is this?" "I don't know. However, after the hunters killed the undead, they would dig out this thing from their head. This shows that it should be very valuable. Otherwise, the hunters would not turn a blind eye to things like gold and dig out this thing," Dean said. He had seen a lot of undead with their heads split open. But there was no such thing in the head. It was obvious that the hunters had picked it up. Mason was shocked. "You said that the hunters killed the undead for this." Chapter 57. This thing has a heat absorption characteristic. It proves that my previous speculation is correct. These undeads are likely to be affected by it. They will sense our body temperature and gradually gather here. The way they hunt is not by tracking the smell of blood, but by tracking the heat. Dudian secretly thought. Scott's team has a large number of people. The heat produced by them is even more amazing. It should attract more undeads. In other words, there is a very large number of undeads in the area number 8. This is by no means caused by the hunters. It is likely that they have moved from other areas. Dudian frowned as he thought of this. Previously he had glanced at Scott's map. He remembered that there was a gray area near the area number 8. There were several green and blue areas which were the hunting areas of other consortiums. Dudian said to Mason and Zach, "This thing can help us reduce our body temperature. We can get rid of the undead's tracking. However, we still can't get too close to them. We have to find a way to hunt an undead's and dig out the cold ball in its brain. Only then we can get rid of the undead's tracking." Mason was surprised. "With this thing, we can get rid of the undead's tracking? How can we hunt them? They are too strong. We are not their opponents." Zach asked. Dudian smiled. "We humans are not strong in fighting, but in wisdom. We can't confront them head-on, but we can use their lack of IQ to easily kill them." Easily? Zach and Mason looked at each other in a daze. 3 years of training taught scavengers how to search for prey in the wilderness and how to survive in a variety of environments. But it didn't teach them how to hunt because that was the hunter's job. Therefore, although they had been trained, but faced with such a problem, Mason and Zach were completely at a loss. But compared to other ordinary children, they didn't panic and collapse. It was very rare. The simplest way is to use fire. Dean smiled. You go and find some cloth. As long as the cloth can be ignited, the more the better. I will replace Sham and lead them to a place. I will give you 10 minutes to gather the cloth downstairs. Mason and Zach's eyes lit up. They immediately guessed what Dean wanted to do. They quickly left the room and went to each floor to look for combustibles. Dean went back upstairs and saw that Sham was still tirelessly throwing stones. You take a break, I'll do it. Sham replied. No, I can do this kind of rough work. Whether we can leave this place or not, it's all up to you. Dean laughed. Mason and Zach have gone to take care of it. They will be able to leave here soon. Everything is ready. What do you mean? Sham blankly asked. Dean shook his head and smiled. Nothing, everything is ready. I will finish the rest of the work. You go upstairs and find some stones. Don't empty this floor or it will collapse. Then, he grabbed the gravel on the ground and looked at the wandering corpses at the entrance of the community. He suddenly found that the number of these corpses had increased by a few more. In the distance there seemed to be a single corpse staggering over. Dean immediately grabbed the stone and threw it to the other side of the building, leading the undeads to the other side. 10 minutes later, Mason and Zach gathered the combustibles in the open space under the building and formed a circle. At this time, Dean continued to throw stones or glass into the open space in the center of the circle. The violent sound immediately attracted the attention of the group of undead. They immediately staggered over and entered the center of the circle. At this time, Mason, who had received Dean's order in advance, immediately threw lit torches from the second floor. 4 or 5 torches tumbled down from the air and fell on the combustibles. Due to the relatively close height, only one of the 5 torches fell. The other 4 fell on the clothes. The flames burned along with the clothes and soon ignited the whole circle. The clothes and rotten wood furniture were burned together into a raging fire. The undeads in the center of the burning circle seemed to have an instinctive awareness to avoid the flames. They immediately ran out of the circle when the flames burned. Seeing this, Dean's face slightly changed. He immediately continued to throw stones and glass to attract the undeads with violent sound. However, the undead's awareness of fire was particularly strong. The sound couldn't attract them. Dean's face changed. He hurriedly shouted downstairs, "Bring the fire to them!" Mason, Zach and Sham were surprised for a moment. They immediately implemented the second set of backup plan prepared by Dean. That was to ignite the undeads. This plan was originally worried that the burning circle would not burn the undeads inside. They were ready to add fire to their bodies. But now it happened to come in handy. The 3 quickly picked up some bedsheets and other clothes on the ground and threw them downstairs to the undeads inside the burning circle. Soon the undeads were hit by the clothes. Although they were not injured, but when they ran out of the burning circle covered with bedsheets and quilts, they were ignited by the fire. Dean breathed a sigh of relief and watched quietly. It didn't take long for the flames to extinguish. There were 7 or 8 charred corpses lying in the burning circle. The rest of the undeads fell outside the burning circle. Some of them were not ignited by the flames. They fled hundreds of meters away and continued to stagger and approach. Dean immediately threw stones to lead them to the distance. Then he let Sham come over and continued to use sound to lead them away. He went downstairs and was ready to call Mason and Zach to collect the corpses. Suddenly, he saw one of the arms of the undeads. It seemed that it was slightly raised. He could not help but be shocked. Didn't the flames burn them? The bodies are burnt, but the dark blue ball in the head can control them. Dean's face changed. He called Mason and Zach to continue to throw combustibles to cover the bodies of the undeads to make the fire more vigorous. After burning for 7 or 8 minutes, Dean carefully observed the undeads for a while. He threw stones to the center of the undeads. There was no reaction. He was relieved and called Mason and Zach to collect the corpses. The 3 of them came downstairs. When Sham was leading the rest of the undeads away, They immediately used cloth and gloves to drag the charred corpses downstairs and cut off their heads. Mason and Zack gradually loosened their courage and tried to cut off the heads of the charred corpses. Soon, the heads of the charred corpses were cut off. A total of 8 heads. Dean directly cut open their heads and saw that the tissues in their skulls had softened. However, what surprised Dean was that the dark blue ball in their skulls was also melting. At this moment, it had melted from the size of a thumb to the size of a soybean, and the melted liquid was translucent like water. The color of the melted liquid was dark blue. This dark blue ball is afraid of high temperature? Dean was stunned. Chapter 58. Dean quickly cut off the other head. He saw that the dark blue balls were in a melting state. He was confused. Wasn't this thing supposed to absorb heat? How could it melt at high temperature? Could it be that this was the purpose of it absorbing heat? Although he was puzzled, Dean quickly used his dagger to pick them out. They rolled to the ground outside the head. The dark blue balls stopped melting after leaving the scalding temperature of the skull. Dean's eyes fell on the melted light blue liquid. As time passed, the temperature of the cranial tissues gradually decreased. The color of the light blue liquid gradually became thicker. The next moment, Dean, Mason, and Zack were horrified. The light blue liquid was like a living liquid. It twisted and shrank back into a mass. It slowly condensed into a dark blue ball. Dean was completely stunned. This scene gave him a familiar feeling. It was like water freezing into ice. The dark blue balls seemed to have such characteristics, but it didn't need to wait until the temperature reached 0 to freeze. Moreover, it had an efficient heat absorption characteristic. Dean looked at the dark blue balls. He felt as if a dark blue eyeball was staring at him. He had a creepy feeling. Although he didn't know what it was and why it would appear in the brain of the undead, but he felt that it was extremely dangerous. It was an instinct. Of course, it could also be a wrong intuition due to the influence of the scene. In any case, Dean didn't want to get too much contact with this thing. He thought that he would have to study this thing in his exclusive alchemy laboratory. This terrible virus made him feel that he had entered the freezer 300 years ago. He seemed to have missed something. Only by thoroughly studying the virus could he know one or two things. Mason looked at Dean lost in thought. He whispered, "Dean, can this thing still be used?" Dean looked at him and said, "Yes, but be careful. Wrap it in cloth and isolate it far away." Mason happily nodded. He immediately found the cloth and picked up the dark blue balls and wrapped them in the cloth. Dean also picked up one. The cold feeling came again. It was the same as before. He was relieved. In any case, this thing could help them avoid the heat detection of the undead. Continue to arrange the burning circle. Dean put away all the balls and said to Mason and Zack. Mason said, "Do we have to kill these undead? We can go around them." Dean shook his head slightly. The hunters didn't pick up the gold, but took out this thing. It shows that the value of this thing is higher than the gold jewelry. So we can hunt as many as we can. This is a lot of wealth. Both of them were surprised. Zack patted his thigh. "Yes, we are now doing the hunter's work." "Ha ha ha," Mason laughed. "Fortunately, Dean is smart. This is a good way to make money. Although these undeads are terrible, but they are stupid. It is too easy to kill them. Let's kill this batch and continue to look for other undeads to hunt. Don't pick up anything. Those broken metals are certainly not valuable. Don't pick up those broken metal things. It is certainly not as valuable." Dean rolled his eyes. Dean thought. Of Mason, Dean was scared. The three of them cleaned up and continued to burn the corpses. Half an hour later, all the wandering undead outside the community were killed by them using the burning circle. In addition to the previous 3 undead, they harvested a total of 21 dark blue balls. "Where are we going next?" Mason was carrying a backpack of dark blue balls. He excitedly said, "Go to the gray area that Scott said? It has not been cleaned. There must be a lot of undead." Dean was speechless. "Are you crazy? Didn't you see how many undeads were killed by hunters on the street? If you go to the gray area, you will be surrounded by a sea of undeads before you can arrange anything. Don't think about money. Mason listened to him and recalled the number of undead along the way. He suddenly shivered and his face turned pale. Zack sighed and said, "Dean is right. It is too risky to go to the gray area. Moreover, there are certainly more bone rats than here. These beasts are not brainless like undead." Sham whispered, "Let's go find Scott and the others. They have a map and know the way back. Moreover, there should be a lot of undeads being led away by them. We can go and help them and kill those undead." Dean nodded. "Let's do it. Let's eat something to replenish our physical strength." They were so tired from the previous battle that they didn't have time to rest. At this moment, when they heard this, they all felt their stomachs growling. They immediately opened their respective backpacks and took out their dry rations and water to eat. However, 3 years of training had taught them temperance. Everyone nibbled a few mouthfuls and drank a little water. They stopped because they didn't find a new source of food. The things in the backpack were likely to be their food for 10 days. When they were ready to set off again, a figure suddenly ran from the street outside the community. The speed of this figure was extremely fast. When he saw the corner in front of him, he immediately jumped up and directly jumped over the top of the security booth next to the residential area. After landing, he didn't stop and went into the residential area. He leaned against a wall and gasped for breath. This scene suddenly fell into the eyes of Zack, who was on sentry duty. "Dean, come over and see." Zack quickly called out to Dean. Dean was surprised for a moment, but quickly walked over. He saw the location that Zack was pointing at. There was a youth in black armor on the ground floor. There was a black bow on his back and a quiver on his back. He looked like a silent ghost archer. However, the way he covered his right arm revealed that he was injured at the moment. "Hunter!" Dean was startled. When Zack, Mason, and Sham heard his words, they couldn't help but stare blankly for a moment. Then they suddenly reacted. Their group of scavengers didn't wear such attire. Moreover, the collective configuration of the scavengers was a dagger. This dagger wasn't used for fighting, but to peel bark or to cut things that needed to be cut when scavenging. In the definition of consortium, scavengers didn't need to fight. If they encountered monsters that hadn't been cleaned up, they could only run. If they could run away, then they would be lucky. If they couldn't run away, then they would die. Just like cannon fodder on the battlefield, their only role was to consume the enemy's ammunition, not to take the enemy's head and bring victory. Every position was assigned a value within its own function. This was management. Hunter! Mason, Zack, and Sham were excited. For scavengers like them, hunters were an unattainable existence. They were the real existences comparable to the nobles. They were qualified to discuss conditions with the nobles. And they were scavengers. Throughout their life, they were just scavengers. Good or bad, high or low, nothing more than looking at the value of the materials they scavenged. But no matter how high the value they created, they would only be scavengers because they didn't have the light physique. This was something that couldn't be changed. The consortium would cultivate Dean as a seed. In addition to his scavenger training results, they mainly investigated his resume. His body radiation content was the same as the hunter's light physique. That was why the consortium was willing to give him the opportunity to become a hunter. Otherwise, no matter how high the value Dean created for the consortium was, he was doomed to be a scavenger. Dean wasn't happy because he had seen hunters. After coming to the giant wall, he saw the ruins and the bloody scene of corpses all over the place. He understood that these hunters who fought in such an environment all year round were not good people. This was why Fino almost killed him, because he told him about the hunters. In the eyes of the hunters, life was so humble and weak. "This is a hunter from the consortium." Dean noticed the medal on the chest of the youth. His heart was a little relieved. If it was a hunter from other consortiums, It would be better not to expose them. Otherwise they would be killed. While Dean and others were observing each other, the hunter noticed the traces of burning rings on the ground not far away. He was startled for a moment. He didn't expect that there would be people here. There was a trace of joy in his eyes. He immediately ran towards the burning rings. He felt the residual heat of the burning rings. It was extremely hot. It could be seen that the fire had just been extinguished. He glanced at the corpses on the ground. There was a bit of doubt in his eyes. He was disappointed, but he suddenly thought of something. His eyes lit up again. He immediately looked at the ground. Soon he found a nearby building. There was a trace of smile on his face. His figure quickly rushed in. "He is aware," Mason quickly said. Zack looked at Dean and said, "Dean, if he knows about us, it shouldn't be a problem. Will he rob us?" Dean sighed at the keen observation of the hunter. He also felt the gap between him and the hunter. He just glanced at them and instantly judged their location. The hunter was obviously an experienced veteran. He looked at Zack and shook his head. He shouldn't want it. After all, there are tens of thousands of corpses on the ground. He should disdain us. Zack and the other two were relieved. Chapter 59. You guys must be freshly graduated scavengers, right? The black-armored youth quickly glanced at the room and saw some charred heads on the ground. When he saw the cracked appearance of the head, he couldn't help but look at Dudian and the other three. "Is it the first time for you to scavenge, or have you been here a few times? You can kill these undeads that have reached level 4, and also know how to collect the cold crystals from their brains." "Oh, interesting." Dudian felt his scalp tighten as he was stared at by the youth's eyes. It was as if he had become prey and would die at any time. He whispered, "We are the new scavengers that joined the consortium. You are the hunter. We were separated from the main team and were chased by these undead. We inadvertently thought of this method. I didn't expect that it would be able to deal with these monsters." The black-armored youth glanced at him. It was easy to see that this boy was the core of the group. He smiled and said, "Don't be nervous. I'm very happy that the consortium was able to recruit smart and quick-witted fellows like you. I'm a bit injured and need to be bandaged. You guys light a fire for me and make some space." Dudian looked at the youth's right arm and nodded. He said to Zack, "You light the fire. I'll find some clean cloth for the hunter to bandage." It was the first time for Mason, Zack, and Sand to see the hunter at such a close distance. They were excited and couldn't wait. They immediately got busy. It seemed that it was an honor to serve the hunter. The black-armored youth saw that he was about to enter the next room and said, "There's no need. These things are full of radiation and germs. How can I bandage them? I have first aid supplies in my bag. Little guy, you're pretty smart. Go and keep watch for me. Tell me immediately if there's any movement." He went into the living room and sat down. He didn't care about the horrible burnt skulls around him. He swept the skulls with his thighs to make space. He threw the black backpack on his back and said to Mason, "Open the bag and find the gauze inside." Mason nodded and was about to grab the backpack. When the black-armored youth saw the dirt on his gloves, he couldn't help but frown. "Bastard, take off your gloves. Do you want to dirty my bag?" Mason was shocked. His face suddenly turned red. He hurriedly took off his gloves and opened his backpack. He took out gauze and asked, "Mr. Hunter, do you have disinfectant here? I need to disinfect first before bandaging." "Do I need you to teach me that?" The black-armored youth snorted coldly and said, "There is a knife and a bottle inside. Did you see that? The bottle is filled with alcohol. You scavengers should have learned first aid knowledge, right?" Macon quickly nodded and immediately poured the alcohol from the bottle onto the knife. He put it on Zack's torch and made it hot. Macon said, "Mr. Hunter, you should loosen the wound first. Let me use the alcohol to disinfect the wound." "I'll do it myself." The black-armored youth grabbed the bottle and flicked his finger. The bottle cap flew out. He loosened his arm and sprinkled the alcohol on the wound. His face twitched in pain, but he still clenched his teeth and endured. Dean and Macon immediately saw the wound. It was a sharp claw mark, deep enough to see the bone. The skin of the wound had ulcerated. The black-armored youth tightly held the wound, not to endure the pain, but to prevent the blood from spreading. The black-armored young man grabbed the red-hot knife, clenched his teeth, and cut away at the wound. Soon, he dug out the festering flesh from the wound. The sharp pain had already caused his head to be covered in hot sweat, as if he had just been drenched in rain. However, during the entire process, he didn't make a sound and just clenched his teeth tightly. This made Dean extremely shocked. Is this the quality of a hunter? Even the soldiers who often go to the battlefield may not have such strong willpower? At this time, after removing the bad flesh, the black-armored youth asked Macon to help him bandage. It didn't take long for his right arm to be bandaged with layers of gauze. The black-armored youth wiped the sweat from his forehead, lightly exhaled, and leaned against the wall slightly panting. Dean looked at him and calmly said, "Mr. Hunter, the 8th area has been cleaned. How come there are so many undeads? Did they migrate from other nearby areas?" "Don't bother me." The black-armored youth gently closed his eyes and said in a displeased tone. Dean was startled and immediately stopped talking. A few minutes later, the black-armored youth said, "You have food, give it to me." Macon, who was next to him, hesitated. "Mr. Hunter, this is our food. If you eat it, the black-armored youth suddenly opened his eyes, as if there was a flash of cold lightning. "What? You don't want to?" Macon was shocked and quickly said, No, but, here is my food. There is not much left. Mr. Hunter, I will give it to you." Macon is not sensible. Please don't blame him. Sham, who was next to him, quickly said. At the same time, he handed over his backpack, shook it open, and handed the dry food inside to the black-armored youth. Mason and Zach's face slightly changed. Although they respected the hunters, but it was different when it came to their own losses. They couldn't help but look at Dean. Dean nodded slightly as if he was acquiescing to their decision. Both of them could not help but secretly feel pain in their heart. The black-armored youth patted Sham's head and said, "Little guy, you are sensible." He grabbed the dry food and ate it. After eating, he stretched out his hand. "Water." Sham quickly handed it to him. The youth drank and threw the empty water bag to the side. He continued to sit and rest for a while. Then he slowly got up and gently moved his right arm for a while. It seemed that this simple bandage had stabilized his injury. He was very satisfied with a smile. Then he looked down at Dudian and the others. He narrowed his eyes and suddenly pointed to Mason. "Little guy, you come with me." Macon was surprised. "Go where?" "You will know." The black-armored youth laughed. Macon hesitated. "Are we going back? But I have a task." "Follow me." "Why so much nonsense?" The black-armored youth frowned and impatiently said. Macon was startled. He realized that something was wrong and couldn't help but look at Dean. Dean also felt a trace of unusualness. "Mr. Hunter, we respect you very much. But we have our own task. If we can't complete it, then we will be expelled by the consortium. I hope you can understand. If you need any help from us, as long as you tell us, we will be happy to help as long as it is within our ability." You're quite good with your words. I need your help right now. Seeing that you guys have a good relationship, I'll let the 4 of you come together. The more the better." The black-armored youth impatiently waved his hand. His last sentence seemed to be muttering to himself. Dean's face slightly changed. "Can you tell us what it is?" What he said before was just polite words. They were just scavengers. How could they help the hunters? Moreover, if the hunters needed their help, it would certainly not be a common thing. After all, the hunters' mission was to hunt monsters. The black-armored youth's eyes narrowed. There was a trace of hostility in his eyes. But he seemed to think of something. The hostility in his eyes quickly converged. There was a smile on his face as he said, "It's nothing important. I found some precious materials, but I can't carry too much by myself. The four of you come with me and help me carry them back to the giant wall. Don't worry, I will talk to the higher-ups and you will get half of the materials." Mason, Sham and Zack were startled when they heard this. Mason couldn't help but be pleasantly surprised. "Elder, is this true? You won't lie to us, right?" Zack was equally excited. Only Sham was slightly puzzled. He felt that something was wrong, but he couldn't think of the reason. He could only look back at Dean. Chapter 60. Dean and the others followed the youth and left the residential building. They came to the outside of the community and went to the place where Scott and others were previously separated. It didn't take long for two undeads to appear on the street in front of them. They seemed to feel the heat of Dean and others. They immediately turned around and walked towards them. Their pace was obviously accelerating. Dean held the dagger and stared at the back of the hunter. If the hunter abandoned them and escaped, he would immediately turn around and run away with Mason and others. After all, they had no way to resist these undeads in a head-on battle. However, the youth just slightly frowned when he saw the two undeads. The next moment, he took out a sharp dagger from the strap on his leg and took the lead to run. The moment he approached the two undeads, he suddenly twisted his feet. His body crisscrossed like a black whirlwind. The heads of the two undeads were cut off from their necks and fell to the ground. Instant kill. Dean and others' pupils shrank and their faces were aghast. Although they knew that the hunter's duty was to hunt these monsters, but they didn't expect that the hunter would be so strong. This was simply a one-sided slaughter. The youth shook the blood on the dagger and inserted it into the strap on his leg. He looked back at the dazed Dean and others. He faintly smiled and waved his hand, motioning them to keep up. Dean and the other three quickly followed him. Dean noticed that the dagger on his trouser leg was extremely sharp. Their dagger was not on the same level as the dagger. It was estimated that the dagger was made of excellent steel. On the other hand, his dagger had rolled back after continuously cutting the necks of the corpses. Only the part near the hilt was still sharp, and the front part had long been rolled into a ruler's length. The things in their heads. Dean was about to bend down to collect them. The youth noticed and lightly shouted, "Don't waste time, hurry up." Dean slightly frowned, but still gave up to continue to collect. He remembered the location in his heart and waited for the opportunity to come back to collect. After all, this thing may be common to the hunters, but for them it was a big fortune. Along the way, they encountered more and more scattered undeads, but along the way, the black-armored youth did not hurt Dean and others. Every time they encountered an undeads, he would take the initiative to attack, relying on his dagger to easily kill them. His speed was far faster than the undeads, and it was obvious that he had received close combat training. His fighting skills were extremely skilled, so the undeads could not even touch him. Dean followed behind, silently observing and learning. He knew that in this era of cold weapons, people had developed fighting techniques to an extremely profound level. Just the killing fighting techniques displayed by this black-armored youth made Dean gasp in amazement. Killing people like cutting grass, his movements were crisp and neat. Even if his arm was injured, there was not the slightest bit of sloppiness. Is this the warrior cultivated on the edge of life and death? Mr. Hunter, will you save Scott and others? They have a lot of people and should not be far from here. Mason asked boldly. Along the way the black-armored youth protected them. They felt that the black-armored youth's nature was not bad. They gradually had a good impression of him. As for eating Sham's food and water, it had been automatically ignored. The youth snorted and said, "What do you think I am, a medical staff?" Mason was stunned. At this moment the youth's face changed. He looked back at the street. Dean noticed that the place he was looking at was the first place they escaped from. It was also the street where the undeads first appeared. Dean seemed to feel the ground under his feet gently trembling. It seemed that there were tall buildings collapsing in the distance. There was a soft roar. The youth's eyes narrowed. There was a trace of bloodthirst in his eyes. He looked up and glanced at the surrounding buildings. Soon, his eyes locked on the top of the tallest office building in the vicinity. The building had long been covered with moss and vegetation. The windows were rusty and dilapidated. He glanced at it and smiled. He bowed to Dean and the others. "You wait here. You can't leave without my order." Dean's face changed. "What about you?" "I have something to do. I'll be back soon." The youth's eyes were serious. "Remember, you can't leave without my order. If anyone leaves without permission, don't blame me for being ruthless." At this point, he glanced coldly at the four of them and said, "You'd better remember what I said. Otherwise, I'll skin you alive even if you return to the consortium." He looked back at his previous position, sneered and quickly left. He rushed to the front of the office building like a black cat and disappeared from the sight of Duddian and the other three. This. Macon was stunned. Where did he go? Dean looked at the disappearing back. There was an unknown feeling in his heart. Suddenly, he thought of the bow and arrows on the back of the youth. Tall buildings, bows and arrows, his pupils suddenly shrank. The archer was lying in ambush from a high vantage point. Could it be that they were being used as bait by the black-armored youth? Run! Thinking of this possibility, Duddian suddenly roared and quickly ran toward the office building. While the youth in black armor had not climbed to the top of the building, he must escape from this area as soon as possible. Otherwise, if they made a slight movement, they might be shot on the spot. He had seen the means of the youth to kill the undeads. He didn't have the confidence to protect himself from being shot by a hunter who was good at archery. Mason, Zack, and Shaw were stunned and puzzled. But because of their trust, they subconsciously followed behind Dean. Mason hurriedly said, "Dean, what happened? Why are we running? If he knows Dean had seen the black-armored youth kill the undeads along the way and protect them. He had a good impression of him, but now it was gone. He said in a cold voice, "We are likely to be used by him. He is using us as bait to lure his prey into the trap." Bait? Mason, Zack, and Shaw were stunned. But soon they thought of the probability of this possibility. They suddenly shuddered. Dean had run to the office building. He gently gasped for breath. He looked back and saw the three people following him. He was relieved. "Go around to the other side. Don't let him find us." Zack's face was ugly. "If we meet him later, he won't let us off easily. Even if we hide from him and return to the giant wall, he won't give us a good fruit to eat." Dean's eyes were cold. He coldly said, "Then kill him." Mason and the other two couldn't help but be startled. They looked at him with astonishment. Mason couldn't help but say, "Kill him? My God, do you know what you are saying? He is a hunter. How can we kill him? No, how can we kill him? Even if we can kill him, it is a big crime." "Dean, are you sure?" Sham's face was slightly pale. "If your speculation is wrong, then he just let us stand there. He has some personal matters to deal with." "Then we will." Dean was startled. This possibility was indeed there, but how could he gamble? There was only one life. If his speculation was right, then staying there was the same as waiting for death. It was obvious that the hunter who could easily kill the undeads needed bait to kill them. It was absolutely terrifying. They were doomed to be unable to escape once they saw it. Although there were many other possibilities, but this was the biggest one he could think of. If it was wrong, then it was wrong to the end. Dean thought of the desert assessment 3 years ago. The 3-star alchemist, Rosyard, had died in his hands. His heart was hesitant and indecisive. This was a choice. Perhaps it was just one of the possibilities he speculated. Even if this possibility was wrong, he still had to make a choice. That was to kill. We have left that place. Whether the speculation is right or wrong, we must kill him. Otherwise, we will be suppressed by him in the future. or even die in his hands. Dean's eyes were cold as he resolutely said. Mason and the other two looked at his eyes. They took a deep breath and hesitated. After all, if they participated in the action of killing the hunter, then they were murderers. For any good people, the word murderer was too heavy. Dean also looked at them, waiting for their choice. There was a little fear in his heart. If they didn't choose not to participate, then what would he do if they knew about his action? He didn't dare to think about it. In the short time he had been here, he felt that the evil door that was sealed in his heart was slightly opened. A lot of evil thoughts were released. But some things were his bottom line that he didn't want to cross. Roar! At this moment, a low roar suddenly sounded from the corner where the few people were previously standing. Chapter 61. The top of the dilapidated high-rise building had been baptized by the radiation rain for hundreds of years. 2 or 3 floors had already collapsed. Byrne jumped from the wreckage of the broken wall and climbed to the gap at the top of the broken wall. It was a commanding height, and with the cover of the broken wall, it was also very suitable for an ambush. This made him very satisfied, and he felt that this ambush would be very smooth. When he crouched down and approached, he suddenly heard a roar coming from the front of the high-rise building. He was shocked. Did that thing arrive so soon? He quickly adjusted the grip of the bow and quickly took out 2 sharp arrows from the quiver. The arrows were silver, and the cold light flashed in his eyes. He looked down from the crack in the wall and suddenly saw his prey. He saw that in front of him, there were 2 semi-broken buildings covered with vegetation. A black crawling monster jumped out from the corner. It was about 5 meters long. Its whole body was covered with black hair that stuck to its body. Its head was like a wolf. Its mouth was protruding, and its fangs were long and sharp. Smelly saliva constantly flowed down from the gap between the fangs and stained the hair on its chin. Finally came out Defiler. Byrne's eyes narrowed, and a trace of bloodthirsty excitement flashed in his eyes. Rare monster that has reached level 9. As long as I kill you, my magic mark can evolve again and master new abilities. He quickly knocked an arrow on his bow and swept his gaze over. However, he didn't see the figures of the 4 little guys on the empty street in front of the Chu Dai. His expression couldn't help but change and his gaze became incomparably cold. Beast! Damn little bastard! If I didn't want you to struggle a little in front of it and create more time for me to attack, I would have killed you all on the spot. Looking at the Defiler that was shaking its head left and right on the street, as if it was looking for the smell, Byrne's face turned pale. This thing was not a brainless low-level undead. If he rashly attacked, he would definitely be detected by it and alert the enemy. He clenched his teeth and suddenly thought of something. These little bastards said that they are separated from the main force. If I lead it to the main force, I should have a chance to kill it. Thinking of this, hope rose in his eyes again. He quickly opened his backpack and took out a yellow bottle. He opened the bottle cap and sprinkled the yellow powder on his black armor. I have this powder to cover my smell. As long as I don't get too close, it won't be able to find me. I will wait until it eats those little bastards, then I will leave immediately. Byrne secretly made up his mind. Dudian and the other 3 were scared when they saw the black behemoth jump out from the corner of the street. They had only heard of such a horrible monster in stories. Who would have thought that it would really exist in reality? Dean reacted and hurriedly said, "Run, go to the stairs." Mason, Zack and Sham reacted and followed Dudian into the building. "Quick, hide." Sham stuttered and almost cried. The ferocious walking dead was scary enough, but compared with this black behemoth, the former was simply a cute little thing. Dean was also pale as he heard Sham's words. "We can't hide, we have to go to the roof to find him." Macon trembled. He won't save us, we disobeyed his words. We are not asking for help. We are going to kill him. Or we will lead that thing to him. Even if we die, we will pull him down with us. Dean clenched his fist. His heart was full of fear and strong anger. His guess was right. The bastard was really using them as bait. They had helped him to bandage and deal with his wounds. Not only he didn't know how to be grateful, but he even bit them. Moreover, the bite was too deep and too painful. It was a death sentence. Bastard! Dean had never been so angry in his heart. He quickly went up the stairs. At the same time, his mind was thinking very fast. On the top of the high-rise building, Byrne was observing the bastard through the cracks in the wall. He saw that the bastard was looking at the direction of the high-rise building. Apparently, it had found the smell of the 4 little bastards. Brian's eyes flashed a trace of cold light. He secretly said, "Damn little bastard. Why don't you obediently wait for death? Why do you have to run? Do you think that by escaping to the building you can save yourself? You will be bitten to death by it. Worthless garbage. Bastard. Bastard." He knew that Dean and the other 3 were dead. Without the Walking Dead bone powder, to cover the smell, they would be found by the bastard. However, he was not happy. Instead, he gritted his teeth angrily. Dying in the building was of no value to him. In the building, he couldn't find an angle to attack. The previous open street was his perfect hunting ground. But in the building, for a hunter who specialized in long-range archery, it was the worst terrain. At this time, he saw that the bastard had entered the building. He immediately calculated the time in his mind. With the speed of the little bastards, if they left the street from the moment he entered the building, then they should be on the 4th to 6th floor. With the speed of the bastard, it would catch up with them when they reached the 10th floor. And he was on the 23rd floor. When he climbed to the top, he had already noted down the floor of the building. As a veteran hunter, his observation and coping ability were beyond the imagination of ordinary people. If the battle broke out on the 10th floor, I don't know if the bastard would be able to smell the distance between me and the 10th floor. Brian frowned. There was some uneasiness in his heart. After all, he had only seen the simple information of the bastard in the hunting manual. It was described as extremely sensitive to smell, but he didn't know how sensitive it was. After thinking about it, he took out the bottle of Walking Dead bone powder and poured it all on the black armor. He evenly smeared it on all parts of the body. At the same time, his mind was thinking and calculating quickly. Now they should be on the 8th floor. The bastard should be chasing them to the 6th floor. I estimate that they will be eaten soon. If the bastard feels me after eating them, then I can only jump from here. He began to think about the plan of retreat. After all, he couldn't pin all his hopes on the Walking Dead bone powder. Time passed little by little. Byrne's muscles tightened and his lips moved slightly. He was calculating the time and simulating the following process in his mind. These little brats should be dead. Let's see if it will leave the building or chase after us. He held his breath and waited. It was as if time was frozen in his mind. Suddenly, a roar came from the building under his feet. A giant black shadow jumped out and opened its mouth to bite Brian. Chapter 62. Whoosh! Byrne fell straight down the side of the building. At the same time, he saw the fearful infected standing in his previous position. Its front claws overturned the corroded wall. Stones rolled down, but the fearful infected didn't jump down. It growled a few times and turned its head. Its body disappeared from the side of the wall. Most likely it was ready to go downstairs to collect Byrne's body. He breathed a sigh of relief and quickly grabbed the bow on his back. He took out an arrow that was inserted into the notch of the quiver. This arrow was twice as thick as the other arrows, and the end of the arrow was tied with a very thin rope. He turned his head and aimed at another 4-story building on the side. He pulled the bow to its fullest and the arrow flew through the air. Whoosh! The arrow fell on a solar water heater on the top of the building. The force was so strong that it penetrated the moss-covered solar water heater. The arrow was stuck on the floor under the support. The rope was more than 10 meters long. As his body fell, it immediately tightened. The rope broke at the edge of the building, and the heavy force created a deep trench in the corner of the corroded concrete. Holding the rope, Byrne was like a swing as he smashed into the window of the second floor. The glass was instantly shattered. Byrne cut the rope with a dagger the moment he smashed into the window. After 2 continuous rolls, he quickly climbed up and ran forward without looking back. It didn't take long for the fearful infected to rush out from the previous building. Byrne had long disappeared. It raised its nose and gently sniffed. It looked left and right for a moment. Finally it locked the direction and chased after Byrne. About 4 or 5 minutes after the fearful infected left, 4 figures quietly came out from a pillar under the building. Their bodies were dripping with blood and dirty. It was Dudian and the other 3. It should have gone far, Sham whispered. Dudian looked at the direction where the fearful infected left. His eyes slightly flashed as he whispered, "Let's catch up and see. We must find the hunter." Mason, Zack, and Sham were surprised. Mason whispered, "Are you crazy? You still want to chase it? It can find the bastard on the roof, which shows that its sense of smell is extremely terrible. If we are not careful and it smells our body, then we are finished. With this layer of blood covering it, I won't be able to smell it for now." Dean glanced at the smelly blood on his body and said, "The blood was from the undead in the corridor. When he climbed to the second floor, he happened to see the undead in the corridor. He suddenly thought of this idea. That was to smear the blood of the undead on their bodies to cover up the smell and pretend to be undead. The dark blue balls in the heads of these zombies were taken out, and their body temperature returned to normal. They began to rot, and the smell of blood mixed with rotten flesh was very strong. Dean noticed that the monster ignored the corpses on the roadside, so he took the risk to try it. In order to disguise himself thoroughly, he let Mason and the other 2 hold an undead and smear their rotten blood all over his black armor, including his face. However, considering the toxicity of the blood, Dean didn't directly smear it on his face, but held it on the cloth and then covered his face with the cloth. Although some of the blood would penetrate into his face, but it was the most important thing to save his life. Moreover, in order to divert the attention of the monster and reduce the weight, the 4 of them threw all their backpacks on the first floor. The backpacks were stained with their sweat, so it was too dangerous to put them on the side. It was a desperate last attempt, but they didn't expect to succeed. The few of them had escaped from death. They didn't celebrate, but the 3 of them heard Dean's bold words. They shook their heads again and again. "We were lucky before, but if we catch up and something happens, then we will die," Sham also advised. Dean looked at the 3 of them and said, "If you don't want to, then wait for me here, or go to the main force. The hunter must be killed, or we won't be at peace when we go back." This monster confirmed his guess, and also made Dean more deeply understand the cruelty of hunters. He didn't think that such a cold-blooded and cruel person would easily let go of people who disrupted his plan. If they fell into the hands of the other, it was estimated that death would be a light punishment, and maybe they would be tortured to death. Instead of pinning their hopes on the mercy of the hunter, it was better to cut off the hidden dangers himself. Mason and the other 2 were surprised. Seeing Dean was ready to catch up, Mason said, "I'll go with you. The 4 of us will live and die together. If we die, then we die together." His thick eyebrows and big eyes showed a resolute look. Dean deeply looked at him and nodded slightly. At this time, Zack and Sham heard Mason's words, and also stood up and were willing to follow Dean. Although they had been together for 3 years and helped each other many times, but they were willing to follow him in such a dangerous moment. Dean's heart was full of warmth. He nodded and said, "Let's go." He took the lead to go out of the door and was ready to chase the direction of the monster. Suddenly, "You little bastards, you're still alive?" A cold and sinister voice sounded above their heads. Dean's pupils shrank as he looked up. He saw the figure of the hunter appeared in the broken window on the second floor. He didn't leave. Byrne was more surprised than Dean. He didn't expect that they could escape the perception of the fear-stained. However, when he saw the bloody slurry on the bodies of the four of them, he suddenly understood.